The tavern door hadn't even finished swinging shut before the barkeep's voice cut through the warm room like a blade through cold butter. "We don't serve charity cases here." He said it loud enough for every person in that room to hear, loud enough that the woman near the door went completely still, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other wrapped tight around her little girl's shoulder. The fire crackled. Someone's fork scraped a plate. Nobody looked up, which was worse, somehow, than if they'd all turned to stare. The barkeep crossed his thick arms and leaned forward over the counter. "You heard me? Take the kid and go." The little girl looked up at her mother. She didn't cry. She just whispered, barely moving her lips. "Mama, let's go. We can't pay." But her eyes had already found something they couldn't leave. A bowl of beef stew, sitting at the window table, still steaming. If you've ever watched a child try to be brave about being hungry, you already know what that looks like. And if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that tavern, because what happened next changed 3 lives forever. The barkeep's name was Roy Hicks, and he had run the Elk Ridge Roadside Tavern for 11 years without once being accused of generosity. He kept a handwritten list tacked to the inside of his supply cabinet, names of people he'd decided weren't worth his time, drifters, miners who came through broke and loud, women traveling alone. He'd added Hazel Brooks to that list 6 months ago, the first time she'd come in asking if he needed help in the kitchen. He'd looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants someone to feel it, and said, "I need people who can move fast." She'd left without another word. That was June. This was November, and the first real snow of the season was pressing against the windows in flat, wet flakes that stuck to the glass and wouldn't melt. Hazel had walked a mile and a half through it with Maisie on her hip for the last quarter mile, when the girl's boots had finally given out enough that every puddle soaked straight through to her socks. She hadn't planned to come back to Roy Hicks's tavern. She'd gone to the general store first, and the feed merchant after that, and the laundry operation behind the hotel, and finally the woman who ran the boarding house on Clearwater Lane. Every one of them had looked at Hazel, and every one of them had found the same answer somewhere in their chest before she'd even finished asking. "No. Sorry. Not right now. Maybe in spring." Spring was 4 months away. Hazel had $11 and some change, a sewing basket, a daughter, and a house that the bank had already started making threatening noises about. She'd walked to Roy Hicks's tavern because it was the last lit window she could reach before dark, and because she'd run out of pride faster than she'd run out of options. The warmth of the room had hit her like something physical when she pushed the door open. Maisie made a small sound, something between a sigh and a gasp, and pressed closer to her mother's side. The place was half full, ranchers mostly, a few traveling merchants, a table of card players near the far wall. Someone had a mug of cider. The smell alone was enough to make Hazel's stomach pull tight and miserable. She'd barely gotten 2 steps inside before Roy looked up from behind the counter. She watched his face go through recognition, then decision, in about a second and a half. "We don't serve charity cases here." He didn't say it quietly. He didn't even pretend to lower his voice. A couple of the ranchers near the counter shifted on their stools, that particular kind of shift men do when they're uncomfortable but have decided not to be involved. The card players kept playing. Hazel's hand found Maisie's shoulder. Maisie, who was 6 years old and had already learned more about the particular texture of public humiliation than any 6-year-old should know, went very still. Then she tipped her head back to look at her mother, and she whispered it. "Let's go, Mama. We can't pay." With that careful, quiet bravery that broke Hazel's heart clean in half every single time. "I wasn't asking for charity," Hazel said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was going to ask if you needed any help. Kitchen work, cleaning. I can do either." Roy looked at her the same way he had in June, up, then down. The whole length of her, deliberate and slow. "Last thing I need is somebody who can't squeeze between the tables without knocking the plates off." There it was. There was the thing people almost always found eventually, the one they thought passed for wit. Hazel had gotten thinner in her face and her hands since the summer. She could see it in the way her wedding ring moved when she washed dishes. but her body held on to weight the way it always had, stubbornly and without apology, regardless of how little she ate. She knew what Roy Hicks saw when he looked at her. She knew what most of the room saw. She was already turning for the door. Maisie's eyes had stopped on the window table. There was a man sitting alone there, a bowl of stew in front of him, a mug of something beside it. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a working man's face, weathered without being hard, the kind that came from years outdoors rather than years indoors worrying. He hadn't looked up from his meal when Roy made his announcement. He was looking now, looking at Maisie. "Hey." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in that particular way that quiet voices sometimes do in a room that's holding its breath. "I ordered too much again. Elda keeps telling me to stop doing that." He looked at the bowl. He looked at the child. "You'd be doing me a favor, honestly." Roy Hicks said, "Wyatt." "I'm talking to the kid," Wyatt said. "Not mean, not sharp, just even." Maisie looked at her mother. Hazel's pride was a living thing, and it was screaming. 6 months of being turned away from every door in Elk Ridge had put a fine, hard edge on it. The kind of pride that grows up around wounds. The kind you can't always afford to set down even when you probably should. She looked at this stranger with his bowl of stew and his calm face and thought, "I don't know you. I don't take things from people I don't know. I don't put myself in anyone's debt." Maisie whispered, barely audible, "Mama, it smells so good." Hazel closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she guided her daughter toward the window table. His name was Wyatt Granger, and he ran the Granger Ranch on the north slope above Elk Ridge. 600 acres of mixed grazing land, 40 head of cattle, a bunkhouse, and what he privately described as more fence line than any one man should be responsible for. He'd inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his, and the weight of the place sat on him comfortably the way old boots do, worn to the shape of him, familiar in every pressure point. He hadn't planned on company that evening. He came into town twice a month for supplies, and usually ate at the tavern because the alternative was eating alone in his own kitchen, which was the same as eating alone in the tavern, except colder and without anyone to nod at. He'd ordered the stew out of habit and eaten about 2/3 of it before he noticed the door open. He noticed the child first. Children were hard to miss in Roy Hicks's place because Roy actively discouraged them. He had opinions about children the same way he had opinions about everything, loudly and with complete confidence. The girl was small and pale and wore a coat that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves rolled up at the wrists. Her hair was damp from the snow. She was holding her mother's hand with both of hers, which was the grip of a child who had learned to stay close. Then Wyatt looked at the mother. He saw the wet hem of her dress and the boots that had probably been resoled once already. He saw the way she straightened her back the moment she stepped inside, before anyone had even said anything. A preparation, the specific posture of a person who expected to be looked at a certain way, and had decided in advance not to let it land. He saw her face, which was pretty in the way that exhaustion sometimes leaves pretty, stripped down and unguarded. He saw her hand tighten on her daughter's shoulder when Roy opened his mouth. He'd known Roy Hicks for 11 years. He'd never once heard him say a thing that didn't need saying less. Wyatt hadn't planned what he said. He just looked at the little girl's face when she whispered to her mother, and something in his chest that had been sitting quietly for a while did something inconvenient and decisive, and the words came out. Maisie ate the stew. She ate carefully and politely for about 30 seconds, and then hunger got the better of manners, and she ate the way hungry children eat, with focus and commitment. Wyatt flagged Elda down and got a second bowl brought over without making any particular thing of it, just moved his mug to the side to make room. Hazel had sat down across from him with the expression of someone enduring something rather than experiencing it. She'd refused the stew a second time when he'd tried to include her, which he'd expected, so he'd just asked Elda for bread and left it on the edge of the table. Hazel didn't eat any of it for the first 20 minutes. Then she broke off a piece like she was doing it absently, and then another, and then it was gone. "You're Hazel Brooks," he said. Not a question. Elk Ridge wasn't large enough for people not to know each other, at least by name. "I am," she said. "Your husband worked the Carver claim, off the North Ridge." Something crossed her face. "He did. Before the cave-in." He nodded. There wasn't anything to say about the cave-in that she hadn't already heard, so he didn't say any of it. You've been in town since? Since March. Working? She looked at him. It was a particular kind of look, measuring, deciding whether he was asking to be polite or whether he actually wanted an answer. Trying to, she said, not finding much luck. He didn't look away. What kind of work? Whatever kind someone will hire me for. A pause. Then, like she was making a concession, I sew. My mother taught me. I'm good at it. How good? Better than the mercantile's ready-made stock, she said. Something shifted in her voice on that, a tiny edge that might have been pride or might have been the ghost of it. I did alterations for the Hendersons before they moved, patched saddle blankets for 2 of the outlying ranches. I can reinforce stitching so it doesn't fail in the cold, which most factory thread does by February. Wyatt looked at his hands. He was wearing work gloves that he'd tucked into his coat pocket, and even across the table she could see the seam on the left one had split nearly all the way across the palm. I've got 3 coats at the ranch that need work, he said. Collar on one's pulling off entirely, and a canvas cover for the water wagon. The grommets have torn through the material, and I keep losing the ties. She looked at him. You're not hiring me out of pity. No, he said. I'm hiring you because I've got 3 coats and a wagon cover that need work, and because you just told me you're good at it. I'll pay whatever the going rate is. I don't know what the going rate is, she said. I've mostly been negotiating on my own. Then name a price that's fair, and I'll tell you if it is. Maisie had finished the second bowl of stew and was now sitting quietly, watching the 2 adults with the watchful attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. She had a piece of bread in her hand, working at it the same focused way she'd worked through the stew. At some point, without anyone deciding it, the table had become less like a stranger's charity and more like a conversation, and Maisie had apparently decided this was safe. You've got a name? Wyatt asked her. Maisie Brooks, the girl said, very properly. Wyatt Granger. He didn't extend his hand for a handshake because she was 6 and holding bread, but he nodded at her with a seriousness that clearly pleased her. You like ranch work? Maisie glanced at her mother. I don't know. I've never done it. Most people haven't until they have, he said. Your mother will be coming out to the ranch to work on some coats and a wagon cover. You're welcome to come see if you like it. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then, you don't have to include her in that. I know I don't, Wyatt said. There's calves that need checking on, and she looks like she might be useful. Maisie sat up straighter. Roy Hicks, at his counter, had been watching all of this with the expression of a man who has lost control of a situation he felt he should be controlling. He started once to say something, drew breath, even opened his mouth. But Wyatt turned his head slightly, just enough to look in his direction, and whatever Roy had been about to say went back wherever it had come from. The snow was heavier against the windows now. Someone near the fire had fallen asleep in a chair. The card game at the back had wound down, and 2 of the players were arguing quietly about a hand from 3 rounds ago. Hazel finished the last of the bread and sat with her hands flat on the table, looking at them. I'll come by tomorrow morning, she said, if the weather holds enough to walk. I'll come to town, Wyatt said. I've got more supplies to pick up anyway. Save you the walk. She looked like she was going to decline. Then she looked at Maisie, who had fallen slightly sideways against her mother's arm, the bread still loosely held in one relaxed fist, eyes getting heavy. All right, Hazel said. Thank you. She said it the way people say things they've had to practice saying, like the words were fine, but the work of producing them cost something. I should tell you, she added, not quite looking at him, about what he said. When we came in. I want you to know it doesn't change how I work. What people think about how I look doesn't affect the quality of what I produce. I know that, Wyatt said. She looked at him then, surprised in spite of herself. The seam on the Henderson boy's good coat, he said. The one he wore to church last winter. Double-stitched collar. That your work? It was. Held through a full winter, and he works cattle in it on Sundays now because he likes it too much to change. Yeah, he said simply. I know what you can do. She walked back to the house on Meridian Street with Maisie half asleep against her shoulder, the girl's arms loose around her neck, boots dragging. The snow was coming down straight now, no wind behind it, the fat, peaceful kind that piled up quietly and made the town look softer than it was. Hazel's mind wasn't soft. It was doing what it always did on the walk home from somewhere, which was run through everything that had been said and unsaid, cataloging the ways she might have handled it differently, better, with more dignity or less need. She should have turned around at the door. She should have gone out the back of Roy Hicks's place, rather than standing there while he said what he said, where everyone could hear it. She should have... Maisie made a small sound against her neck, something between a hum and a word, the half-conscious syllable of a child sliding towards sleep. And Hazel stopped walking for a moment. She stood in the snow outside the post office with her daughter on her shoulder, and she breathed. The bowl of stew had cost her something. She knew that. Accepting help always cost something. Not money, not anything you could name, but something that belonged to the careful structure of dignity she'd been building since March, stone by stone, in a town that kept knocking them down. She would have to be careful about Wyatt Granger. She would have to be clear about what this was. A business arrangement, work for wages. Nothing owed, nothing assumed. She shifted Maisie's weight and kept walking. Her house was 3 blocks further. 2 rooms downstairs, 1 up, a kitchen that was cold by midnight no matter how much wood she put in the stove. She'd been meaning to stuff rags in the gap under the back door since September. She kept meaning to do a lot of things. She let herself in, got Maisie into bed still half in her coat, and then stood in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and took stock. $11 and some change, a sewing basket with needles in 3 sizes, 2 spools of heavy thread, and 1 of fine, a pair of shears she'd resharpened herself 3 times, and the habit of accuracy her mother had spent 8 years installing in her. A machine. The thing she thought about with a feeling that was almost separate from herself, almost reverential. A treadle-operated Singer, 7 years old, which her mother had left her, which she had carried on a wagon from Cheyenne when Daniel got the mining contract and told her they were moving, which she had placed in the front room of this house on Meridian Street like a piece of furniture she would organize the rest of the space around. That machine was the only reason she'd been able to do any work at all since March. It was also the thing the bank had started looking at sideways in the notices they sent. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands, not crying, just pressing. The way you press a bruise to remind yourself it's real. Tomorrow, Wyatt Granger was going to come by and take her and Maisie out to the Granger Ranch, so she could look at coats and a wagon cover and name a fair price for the work. She would name a fair price. She would do excellent work. She would not allow herself to need anything from this man except what he agreed to pay her. She sat there until the lamp needed trimming, and then she trimmed it, and then she went to bed. I was there at 7:30 the next morning with a wagon and 2 horses, both of them dusted in fresh snow. Maisie saw him from the upstairs window and made the particular sound she made when something exceeded expectation. Hazel had been up since 5. She'd mended one of her own dresses while the stove heated, the one with the tear in the left seam she'd been ignoring since October, because she'd decided that if she was going to a ranch to talk about work, she should not arrive looking like someone who couldn't attend to her own clothes. Her coat was brushed. Her hair was pinned. She had her sewing basket. When she opened the door, Wyatt was tying off the reins on the hitching post at the end of the walk. He didn't come to the door. He just looked up when she opened it and said, "Morning. Snow's not bad on the North Road yet." "Good morning," she said. She put on her coat and called upstairs for Maisie. Maisie came down like water downhill, fast and decisive, already wearing both boots and her coat, and still somehow only half functional, 1 mitten on and 1 clutched in her fist. She saw Wyatt at the end of the walk and slowed slightly, the way children sometimes do when they've decided to present themselves as older than 6. "Morning, Miss Maisie," Wyatt said, with the same seriousness he'd offered the night before. "Morning," Maisie said, and then immediately, "Are those your horses?" "They are." "What are their names?" "The roan is Coot. The gray's called November." Maisie considered this. "That's a good name for a gray horse?" "I thought so too." He lifted her up without ceremony so she could look November in the face, and the horse held still for it, the way horses sometimes do with small children, with a tolerant patience that seems distinct from their ordinary personality. Maisie put her hand flat against November's nose, and the horse breathed on it, and she laughed, surprised, and Hazel stood on the porch and watched this and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tightened. She was careful not to let herself follow that feeling anywhere. The road to the Granger Ranch was 3 miles out of town, and Wyatt drove it without urgency, letting the horses set their own pace through the snow. He didn't make conversation for the sake of making it, which Hazel found she appreciated. Maisie talked enough for everyone, mostly to the horses, occasionally turning around to report things she'd noticed. A hawk on a fence post, a set of deer tracks crossing the road, the way the snow was different in the shadows under the trees than in the open. She notices things, Wyatt said, quiet enough that Maisie, currently occupied with the hawk, didn't catch it. She always has, Hazel said. Her father was like that. A pause. How long? 8 months. He nodded. He didn't say he was sorry, which was a relief. She'd had enough of people saying they were sorry in the particular way they meant it, which was to say they were sorry in a way that was really more about ending the conversation than about anything she felt. He just drove, and Maisie kept narrating, and the snow kept coming down in its quiet, soft way, and Hazel sat on the wagon seat with her basket in her lap, and the cold on her face, and thought, for the first time in a long time, about something other than the bank. A sigh. The ranch was not what she'd expected. She hadn't let herself expect much, which meant she had a neutral sort of image in her mind. Structures, fences, animals. What the Granger Ranch actually was more complicated than neutral. The house was large and well-maintained, not grand, but solid, the kind of building that had been repaired carefully rather than replaced, that bore its age in repainted shutters and a new step on the porch rather than in visible damage. There was a bunkhouse to the left, a barn that needed paint but not structure, and a yard where 2 hands were working on something near the fence line, their breath making small clouds in the cold. Wyatt pulled up near the house and got Maisie down from the wagon. The 2 hands near the fence looked over, and one of them raised a hand. That's Pete and Doyle, Wyatt said. They work the ranch. He looked at Maisie. Pete's wife left a cat with 4 kittens in the barn if you want to go find them. He'll show you. Maisie looked at her mother. Stay where I can hear you, Hazel said. Maisie went. Hazel followed Wyatt inside. The main room was clean in the way rooms get when a person lives alone in them and has a system rather than a preference. Everything in a specific place, not arranged for looking at, but arranged for finding. There was a fireplace with a low fire going and a table large enough for more people than currently ate at it. He brought out the coats, 3 of them, as promised. A heavy canvas work coat with the collar half detached, and 2 pockets that had separated from their linings. A sheepskin coat with a tear along the left side seam where something had caught it, and a long wool coat that was otherwise in excellent condition, except that the cuffs had frayed down to nothing and someone had trimmed them without finishing the edge, which meant the unraveling was going to work its way up the sleeve. Hazel went through them on the table, methodically. She held seams up to the light from the window. She tested thread tension with her thumbnail. She pulled the canvas of the work coat collar away from what remained of the stitching and looked at the backing material, which was in better shape than it appeared because it had been protected by the outer layer. The canvas coat is the most work, she said. 2, maybe 3 hours if I reattach the collar properly and not just tack it. The sheepskin is actually simple, the tears clean, and the materials in good shape. The wool coat... She looked at the cuffs. Did someone cut these? My last ranch hand, Wyatt said, with a flatness that said everything about his opinion of that decision. It's fixable, but I'll need to turn the sleeve back about 1.5 inches to get to good material. That'll shorten them slightly. That's fine. She looked at the wool coat's cuffs a moment longer. Whoever cut these wasn't trying to ruin it, she said. I think he was trying to help and didn't know how. Wyatt looked at her sideways. The cut's too careful, she said. He could have just left it fraying. He tried to solve the problem. A brief silence. That's more generous than how I thought about it at the time. He was probably young, she said. It wasn't an accusation of anything. She set the coat down and straightened. The wagon cover you mentioned. I'll need to see the grommets before I can quote you anything on it. He took her out to the wagon shed. The cover was canvas, roughly 12 feet by 8, and the problem was exactly what he'd described. The grommets, small metal rings set into the material at the edges for threading the tie ropes through, had torn free from the canvas in 4 places, pulling the surrounding material with them and leaving gaps that let in weather. She crouched beside it and worked the damaged areas with her fingers, testing the integrity of the fabric around each failure point. The material's sound, she said. It's not rotted. The grommets were set too close to the edge originally. They should have been centered another 1/2 inch further in. Every one of them would have failed eventually. Can you fix it? I can set new grommets and reinforce the mounting with a doubled canvas patch behind each one. It'll be stronger than it was new. She looked at the remaining grommets. I'd replace all of them while I'm at it, even the ones that haven't failed yet. He looked at her. What's your price? She did the arithmetic in her head. Time, materials, the wear on her needles from canvas work, the cost of replacement grommets, which she'd have to source from the mercantile. $7 for everything, she said, including the grommet hardware. He was quiet for a moment. She felt the familiar brace in her chest, the waiting for the negotiation, for the half-hearted offer, for the gentle suggestion that seemed fair to him if not to her. 8, he said. She blinked. You included the grommets in 7, he said. Hardware's expensive right now. 8 is fair. She stood there in the wagon shed in the cold and didn't say anything for a long moment because she was doing something she hadn't had to do in so long she'd almost forgotten how, which was recalculate in a direction she hadn't been calculating. 8 is fair, she said finally. Thank you. From somewhere across the yard, faint but clear, she heard Maisie laughing. The full, unguarded, pulled-out-of-you kind that children only produce when something has genuinely surprised them. One of the kittens, probably. Or Pete, who from this distance looked like the kind of man who knew how to make small children laugh. Hazel listened to her daughter laugh in the cold morning air, and something shifted in her that she didn't let herself look at directly. Not yet. She came back the following week and the week after. The coats took 3 visits because she was careful, and also because the sheepskin coat's tear, once she had the material flat on the table in better light, turned out to be longer than it had looked. It ran under the arm and about 2 inches down the side seam, meaning the lining had to be addressed separately before she could close the outer layer. She told Wyatt about the extra work before she started it, quoted him an additional amount, and watched his face for the particular expression she'd learned to dread, the one that said the scope of things was becoming inconvenient. He said, All right, show me what you'll do. She showed him. He leaned over the coat on the table while she explained the sequence, lining first, then the outer seam, then a catch stitch along the join to keep the 2 layers from pulling against each other in different directions when the coat moved. He followed it, she could tell, not just nodding, but actually tracking what she was describing. Where did you learn that? He said. My mother was a seamstress, she said, in St. Louis. She learned from her mother, who'd apprenticed to a tailor in Germany. I learned everything from her. She's still living? She died when I was 19. A pause. That's when I got the machine. He didn't push it further. Maisie had her own routine by the 3rd visit. She appeared in the barn with Pete's supervision each morning, checked on the kittens, who had begun to move around independently and were in that phase of maximum danger and maximum entertainment, and then generally positioned herself wherever Wyatt happened to be working, on the theory that wherever he was likely to be where things happened. Wyatt, for his part, had apparently decided this was workable and assigned her tasks. Counting fence posts in a section he was checking, holding one end of a measuring line, standing on a particular spot so he had a sightline reference. Small things, carefully chosen to be within a 6-year-old's ability and consequential enough to be real. Hazel watched this through the window on the 3rd day while she worked on the sheepskin lining, and she thought, he's doing it on purpose. Not performance, not display. He just looked at a child who had spent 8 months having things taken away from her and found what he could give that wouldn't be charity, usefulness. The particular dignity of being needed. She pulled her thread through and thought, careful. The week the coats were finished, Wyatt brought her 3 more things. A horse blanket with 2 seams failed, a pair of heavy work trousers belonging to Pete that had split along the thigh, and a canvas bag for storing grain that had been torn by a nail at some point and never properly repaired, just tied off with a rope that held grain in but let moisture in too. Then he mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Hendersons' former neighbors, the Allard family, had been asking around about someone to do alterations. Their oldest daughter was getting married in the spring, and her mother's wedding dress needed significant work. Wedding dress alterations, Hazel said. Apparently, he said. She looked at him. Did you tell them about me? I told them you were the best seamstress in the county, he said, with the same flatness he used for most things. She waited for the rest of the statement, the qualifier, the but. And, she said. And nothing, he said. That's what I told them. She looked at him for a moment longer, Then she went back to the canvas bag. I'll charge them by the hour for wedding work, she said. It's more precise work than repairs. I figured you would, he said. She finished the grain bag that afternoon and the horse blanket the following morning. When Wyatt came in to look at the finished work, he ran the seam on the horse blanket between his thumb and forefinger and said, "That'll last another 4 years." "At least," she said. He set the blanket down. Outside, Maisie was having a sustained argument with a calf about something. Hazel could hear her daughter's voice, patient and explanatory, and the calf's intermittent response. Doyle was around somewhere, which meant Maisie was supervised, which meant Hazel could leave most of her attention here. "You're building something," Wyatt said. He wasn't looking at her, just at the blanket. "What you're doing with the work. You know that." She was quiet. "I'm not saying it to flatter you," he said. "I'm saying it because you seem like someone who keeps looking at the ground when there's a view." She looked at her hands on the table. The fingers were calloused, the nails kept short because short nails didn't catch thread. They were a seamstress's hands. Her mother had had the same ones. "I'm looking at what I can afford to look at," she said. "Fair enough," he said. The calf outside said something decisive, and Maisie laughed. Hazel thought, "I am building something." She thought it quietly, to herself. The way you think things you're not quite ready to believe out loud. But she thought it, and in the cold of November, in a stranger's ranch on the north slope above a town that had mostly decided what she was worth, that small thought held more heat than the stove she was sitting next to. She let herself sit with it for exactly one breath. Then she threaded her needle and got back to work. The Allard wedding dress turned out to be more complicated than anyone had mentioned up front. Hazel had expected adjustments, taking in the waist, perhaps letting out the hem, the ordinary work of fitting a garment made for one woman's body onto another's. What she found when Clara Allard's mother, Dottie, unwrapped the dress from its paper cocoon on the kitchen table of the Allard farmhouse was something that had been altered before, poorly, by someone who had taken in the bodice by sewing a single seam directly over the existing one without removing the original stitching first. The result was a ridge of doubled fabric running along the left side that pulled the entire front of the dress slightly off-center, and because the original dress had been constructed with a boning structure inside the bodice, the doubled seam had put pressure on one of the bones until it had cracked and was now sitting at a diagonal inside the lining, threatening to work its way through. Hazel stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment. "The woman in Cheyenne said it was fine," Dottie Allard said, watching her. Dottie was a small, tightly wound woman with the specific energy of someone who'd spent 30 years managing a farm and considered worry a form of productivity. "She said she'd fixed it." "She fixed the size," Hazel said carefully. "She didn't fix it." She lifted the bodice and showed Dottie the ridge. "Feel that." Dottie touched it. Something shifted in her face. "That wasn't there before she touched it." "No," Hazel said. "It wasn't." She turned the dress over and looked at the lining seam along the left side, which had begun to pull in the direction of the cracked bone. "The boning inside is cracked. I'll need to open the lining, remove it, replace it, and then address the seam properly. Then refit the whole bodice for Clara from the beginning." Silence in the Allard kitchen. A clock on the wall. Something boiling on the stove. "How long?" Dottie asked. "The work itself?" 2 full days. Maybe 3, depending on the boning. I'll need to source a replacement if the local mercantile doesn't carry the right size. The wedding's in April. "It's November," Hazel said. "There's time." Dottie looked at her with the measuring expression of a woman who has been told things were fine before and had found out otherwise. "Can you actually do this?" It was a fair question, given the context. Hazel didn't take offense at it. "Yes," she said simply. "My mother made wedding dresses in St. Louis for 12 years. I helped from the time I was Maisie's age. I know boning construction, and I know how to take a bodice apart and put it back together without losing the original structure." She looked at the dress. "This dress is actually well made, underneath what the Cheyenne woman did to it. The original seams are solid, the silk is good quality. If I address the boning and redo the bodice fit, it'll be beautiful." Dottie was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "What will you charge?" Hazel had thought about this on the ride over, which Wyatt had provided again. She still had no wagon of her own, and the Allard farm was 4 miles out of town in the opposite direction from the Granger ranch. She named a figure that was fair given the scope of what needed doing, and watched Dottie's face do the arithmetic that people's faces do when they're calculating worth against cost. That's not cheap, Dottie said. No, Hazel agreed. It isn't. But the woman in Cheyenne was cheap, and now the dress has a cracked bone and a seam ridge, and you're standing here in November with a wedding in April. That landed. Dottie pressed her lips together. Then she nodded. All right. Hazel came back 3 days later with the correct boning, which the Mercantile in Elk Ridge had in a size close enough that she could make it work with minor adjustment, and she spent the better part of 2 full days at the Allard kitchen table with Clara, who was 22 and had the expression of someone who had fully processed that the dress was a problem and had decided the only reasonable response was to trust the person trying to fix it. They talked while Hazel worked, not about the dress mostly, but about Clara's intended, a surveyor named Marcus who was coming from Laramie, and about the Allard farm, and about Clara's childhood memory of her grandmother wearing the dress in a photograph that sat on the mantelpiece. The dress had belonged to the grandmother. Dottie had worn it. Now Clara would. Hazel kept most of this in the back of her mind while her hands were busy with the boning and the silk, but some of it got in anyway. She thought about her own wedding dress, which she had made herself 3 weeks before marrying Daniel, working from a pattern her mother had given her, staying up 2 nights to finish it. She'd worn it once, on a Tuesday in May, and it was currently folded in a box under the bed on Meridian Street because she hadn't been able to make herself give it away or look at it directly. She finished the dress 2 days before she'd estimated. When Clara put it on and stood in front of the mirror that Dottie had positioned near the window for the light, the 3 of them were quiet for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Oh, Clara said quietly. Just that. Dottie put her hand over her mouth. Then she put it down again, briskly, and said to Hazel, Whatever you charged wasn't enough. It was enough, Hazel said, but she said it softer than she'd meant to. Word moved the way it always does in a small community, which is faster than anyone plans and with more detail than anyone controls. By December, Hazel had 4 more requests. A christening gown that needed updating from a grandmother's pattern, a suit coat belonging to the county clerk that had been sitting in his closet for 6 years with a failed lining because nobody local had been able to fix it properly, a set of saddle blankets from a ranching operation 15 miles north that had heard about her work through someone who'd heard from someone else, and a request from Maggie Fenn, who ran the hotel on Main Street, for someone to repair 12 sets of curtain panels that had been damaged when a pipe leaked over the storage room the previous spring. The curtain panels were the least interesting work Hazel had done in months, and also the most financially significant, because there were a lot of them, and Maggie Fenn paid on time, and in exact amounts without any of the sideways negotiation that some of Hazel's clients still attempted. She spent 4 days in the back of the hotel with her basket and her shears, working through the panels methodically while Maggie moved in and out of the space, checking on various hotel operations. And on the 3rd day, Maggie sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and said, You need a proper space. Hazel looked up. I work out of my house. I know you do, Maggie said. I'm saying you need a proper space, somewhere clients can come without having to walk into your front room, somewhere with enough light and a work table that isn't also your kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The room on the south side of this building has been empty since April. It gets morning light and afternoon light both. I'd rent it to you for less than you're probably thinking, because having a seamstress in the building is useful to me. Hazel set down her work. She looked at Maggie Fenn, who was 53 and had run the hotel alone since her husband went back east for reasons she'd never explained to anyone, and nobody had been bold enough to ask about. Why are you telling me this? Because you're good, Maggie said, without ceremony. And because you're doing what you're doing out of a house with no sign on it and no way for people to find you except word of mouth, which works until it doesn't. She pushed the 2nd cup toward Hazel. Word of mouth got you the curtains. A shop gets you the town. Hazel picked up the cup. The coffee was strong and hot, and she hadn't had any since morning. I can't afford the rent, she said. Not right now. I said less than you're probably thinking, Maggie said. Drink your coffee, and let me tell you the number. The number was genuinely less than Hazel had been thinking. Not free. Maggie Fenn was a businesswoman and had no interest in charity arrangements that complicated the simple math of a hotel room, but real and reachable if Hazel's current pace of work held through the winter. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and did the arithmetic 3 different ways, trying to find the version where it didn't work. She didn't find it. With the Allard job, the hotel curtains, the saddle blanket contract, and the county clerk's coat, she'd made more in 6 weeks than she'd made in the previous 4 months combined. If February brought anything comparable, and the Allard word of mouth was already moving into February, the shop rent was reachable. She wasn't ready to believe it yet. She wrote the numbers down and then sat looking at them the way she looked at most things that seemed too favorable, which was with a specific variety of suspicion. Then a knock at the door. She opened it to find her neighbor from 2 doors down, Eleanor Briggs, who was 70 years old and entirely without social caution. Eleanor held up an envelope. "This came to my house by mistake," she said. "Mailman and his new route. He's been getting the bees mixed up since October." She handed it over and stood there, because Eleanor Briggs never delivered anything without also having something to say. The envelope was from the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending. Hazel opened it. She read it once. Then she read it again, because the first reading hadn't produced a result she wanted to accept. The bank had been corresponding with her since August about the mining debt, Daniel's debt, which she'd inherited along with the house, which was itself collateral against that debt. The letters had started formal and progressively become shorter and more direct. This one was short. It said, essentially, that the current payment arrangement had failed to meet the minimum reduction threshold, and that the bank intended to move to foreclosure proceedings within 60 days unless the full outstanding balance was received or alternative security could be offered. The full outstanding balance was $412. She had $11 when this started. She had more now. She did not have anywhere near $412, and she was not going to have it in 60 days. And the thing that $412 bought was the house on Meridian Street and the Singer treadle machine that sat in the front room of it. Eleanor was still standing in the doorway. "Bad news?" she said, with the frankness of extreme age. "Yes," Hazel said. There was no point in pretending otherwise to Eleanor, who had watched Hazel's life from 2 doors down for 8 months with sharp, unsentimental attention. "The bank." Eleanor made a sound that wasn't quite language. She came inside without being invited and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter when Hazel put it down. "How much?" "Too much," Hazel said. She sat down across from Eleanor. Maisie was upstairs, asleep. The stove had gone low. She should put more wood on it. She didn't move to do it. "I've been building something," she said, and heard herself say it and almost laughed because 6 hours ago she'd thought that thought with something close to hope, and now it sat there with a different weight. "I have work coming in, real work, steady work, but 60 days isn't—" "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't." She looked at the letter again. "Who's the loan officer?" "Chester Braun." Hazel had met Chester Braun twice. He was 45, efficient, and had the specific variety of compassion that existed on paper but not in practice. His letters were technically polite and completely without any acknowledgement of human consequence. "Chester Braun," Eleanor repeated, with a flatness that contained multitudes. "Do you know him?" "I know his mother," Eleanor said, which is not the same as knowing him in this case. She pushed the letter back across the table. "You need a lawyer." "I can't afford a lawyer." "You can't afford not to have one," Eleanor said. "There's a difference between what the bank says it can do and what it can actually do. 60 days isn't a verdict, it's an opening position." Hazel looked at her. "I was married to a lawyer for 40 years, Eleanor said. "Not a good man, but a useful education." She got up from the table with the deliberate effort of someone whose knees had decided to participate in everything consciously. "Put some wood on that stove. You'll talk to Gerald Marsh in the morning." "I don't know who that is." "He's on Clearwater Lane, above the dry goods. Retired mostly, but he still takes cases if they interest him." She put on her coat. "Show him that letter and tell him what you've told me about the work coming in. If Chester Braun is doing what I think he's doing, Gerald will find it interesting." She left. Hazel sat there for another full minute, looking at the letter. Then she got up and put wood on the stove. She went upstairs and stood in the door of Maisie's room. Her daughter was completely out, one arm thrown over the edge of the small bed, her mouth slightly open. She'd had a good day. She'd told Hazel at dinner, with great seriousness, that one of the kittens at the Granger Ranch had bitten Wyatt on the thumb, and that Wyatt had said a word Maisie wasn't going to repeat, but that it had been very satisfying to hear. Hazel had asked if it was a bad word, and Maisie had said, with the careful authority of a 6-year-old, a medium word. She stood in the doorway and looked at her sleeping daughter and thought about the singer in the front room and the shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel and the $412 that stood between all of it and nothing. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Gerald Marsh was not what she'd expected. She'd pictured a retired lawyer as something stiff and formal, someone with a desk and a posture. Gerald Marsh was 71, wore suspenders over a flannel shirt, and opened the door of his office over the dry goods store with the expression of a man who had not been expecting company, but had also not been doing anything he'd miss. He read the letter while she sat across from him at a desk that held 3 stacks of papers, a coffee mug, a hat that had been placed down and forgotten, and nothing else. He read it twice, the same way she had. Then he set it down and looked at her. "How long has this debt been outstanding?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man locating himself in a map. "Daniel, my husband, took the mining contract 17 months ago. He put the house up as collateral for the equipment loan. The equipment loan was with a company out of Denver that sold the debt to the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending when the mine failed." She paused. "I didn't know about the collateral arrangement until after he died." Gerald Marsh looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "The original note. Do you have a copy?" "I have everything Daniel left in his desk," she said. "I can bring it." "Do that." He tapped the letter. "The 60-day notice is Chester Braun being aggressive. It's legal, but the question is whether the underlying debt transfer was handled correctly when the Denver company sold it, because if there are any errors in the assignment documentation, Braun's 60-day clock doesn't start when he thinks it does." He picked up the letter again. "You said you have work coming in. Consistent work?" "Growing," she said. "I have signed arrangements from 6 clients and 3 more pending. I can bring documentation." He looked at her over the letter. "You kept records." "I've kept records since March," she said. "Every job, the agreed price, the date of payment, what was paid." He set the letter down. He had the expression of someone revising an assumption. "All right," he said. "Bring me the original note and your work records and I'll look at this properly." He tapped his fingers once on the desk. "I don't take charity cases." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "Name your fee." He named it. It was less than she'd expected, which she was becoming suspicious was a pattern in her life right now. The things she'd prepared herself for were landing softer than she'd built them up to be. She paid him half up from the carefully maintained envelope she kept in the tin box behind the kitchen flour sack and told him she'd be back the following day with the documents. She walked back to Meridian Street in the December cold with her hands in her pockets and her breath-making clouds ahead of her, thinking. The work she'd been doing was real. Gerald Marsh knew his business, Eleanor had said so, and Eleanor Briggs had 40 years of married to a lawyer education that she hadn't been shy about deploying. The 60 days wasn't a verdict, it was an opening position. She'd been in enough negotiations over the past 8 months. Negotiations she'd had to learn on the job, pricing her own work for people who'd never thought to value it, to understand opening positions. She came home, found Maisie at the kitchen table doing the arithmetic practice that Mrs. Holt at the schoolhouse sent home on Wednesdays, went to Daniel's desk, and pulled out the box of papers she'd organized in April and not touched since because touching them was a particular kind of pain she only did when necessary. She found the original note. She sat with it at the kitchen table while Maisie counted on her fingers beside her, and she read it. She didn't understand all of it. She understood enough. The debt had been assigned from the Denver company to the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending with a date stamp in the margin. The date stamp was in a different ink than the rest of the document. She didn't know if that mattered. She thought Gerald Marsh might find it interesting. She set it aside and helped Maisie with the arithmetic, and that evening there was a knock at the door that turned out to be Wyatt, which surprised her because it was a Wednesday, and he generally came by on Mondays when she had work ready for pickup, or came to collect her for the ranch on the days she was going there. He was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who'd been working up to something in the wagon on the way over. "I heard about the bank letter," he said. She looked at him. "Eleanor Briggs," she said. "Maggie Fenn," he said. "Eleanor told Maggie this morning when she came in for breakfast." Hazel stood back from the door and let him in, because the alternative was having this conversation on the porch in the cold. He came inside and stood in her front room, which had the singer in it, and 2 chairs and a work table she'd pushed against the window for light, and he turned his hat in his hands once and said, "I want to talk to the bank." "No," she said. He looked at her. "I talked to Gerald Marsh this morning," she said. "I have an appointment tomorrow to bring him documents. I'm handling it." "Chester Braun isn't going to negotiate because you bring him documents," Wyatt said. Not unkindly, just practically. "He's going to negotiate if the right person walks in with—" "Wyatt!" She said it evenly. She sat down in one of the chairs and looked at him, because this was a conversation that needed to happen sitting down if they were going to get through it without anyone saying something they'd regret. "Sit down." He sat. He put his hat on his knee. "I've spent 8 months in this town," she said, "being looked at a certain way. You know what that way is because you've seen it. Roy Hicks, the people who wouldn't hire me, the people who quoted me half what the work was worth because they figured I was desperate enough to take it." She looked at her hands. "I've built something in spite of that. I have clients. I have records. I have a lawyer looking at the debt documentation because Eleanor Briggs, who I didn't even know 3 days ago, sat in my kitchen and gave me better advice than anyone has in months." She looked back up at him. "If you walk into that bank on my behalf, you are not helping me. You are confirming every assumption Chester Braun and everyone like him has already made, which is that I don't have the capacity to manage my own affairs." Wyatt was quiet. He looked at his hat, which he was still turning on his knee, and then he stopped turning it. "I know that," he said. "Then why—" "Because I drove past the bank this morning," he said, "and I know Chester Braun, and I know what that letter means when it comes from him at this point in a debt cycle, and I didn't know what else to do with that." He paused. "I should have led with that instead of leading with the solution." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded. It was a real nod, the kind that cost something. "I'm sorry." The singer sat between them in the room, the way it always did, present in its particular treacle machine way, taking up space and light. Maisie had gone quiet upstairs, which meant she was either asleep or reading, and the stove was doing what stoves do when you've just fed them, which was tick and settle and put out heat in its slow, patient way. "The documents Gerald Marsh is looking at," Hazel said. "The assignment documentation when the Denver company sold the debt. There's a date stamp that's in different ink than the rest of the note." Wyatt looked at her. "Different ink." "Gerald Marsh will know what that means," she said. "I don't, entirely, but I think it might matter." He leaned forward slightly. The rancher's quality of attention he brought to things, the same attention he'd given the horse blanket seam, the same he gave to fence lines and weather, was fully present now. "If the assignment wasn't documented correctly, the bank doesn't have clear title to the debt," he said, "which means they can't foreclose on the security." "Gerald Marsh said something similar," she said, in more legal language. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You went to Gerald Marsh this morning and looked at the original note yourself." "Yes." "And you found the ink." "I noticed it. I don't know what it means." "But you kept the original note," he said, "since April." "I keep everything," she said. "I kept every job record, every payment, every letter the bank sent. I organized Daniel's desk in April because I had nothing else useful to do, and it made me feel like I had some control over something." She looked at the singer. "I didn't know any of it was going to matter. I just couldn't stand the disorder." Wyatt sat back. He looked at her the way he had at the wagon shed when she'd explained about the original grommet placement. Not like she'd surprised him exactly, but like something he'd suspected had been confirmed. "All right," he said. "Let me know what Marsh says." "I will." He got up and put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. "The wagon covers held through 2 storms," he said. "No ties lost." "Good," she said. "It's better than good," he said. "2 of the new grommet patches look like they've been there since the thing was made." She almost smiled. "The material wanted them in the right place all along," she said. "It just needed someone to put them there." He looked at her for a moment with his hand on the door, not quite smiling either, but not smiling. Then he went out into the December night, and she heard the wagon start up, and she sat in her front room with the singer and the stove and the organized paper evidence of 8 months of surviving, and she let herself feel, cautiously and without trusting it too much, that the pieces of something were accumulating. Gerald Marsh called her back in 4 days later. He had a second document spread beside the original note when she came in. Something he'd requested from the county records office, he explained. A copy of the debt assignment filing. The date stamp, he said without preamble, is a problem for Chester Braun. She sat down. The assignment from the Denver company to the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending was filed with the county office in September, he said. The date stamp on the original note reads August. But he held up a finger. The Denver company's own dissolution records, which I had a colleague in Denver pull yesterday, show that the company was in insolvency proceedings from July onward and did not have legal authority to assign assets after July 22nd. He looked at her. The assignment was made in August, which is after the company lost that authority. The county filing happened in September to try to clean up the paperwork, but the underlying assignment is invalid. The room was very quiet. What does that mean? Hazel said. It means the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending does not legally own this debt, he said. They paid the Denver company for something the Denver company did not have the right to sell them, which is a problem for Chester Braun, not for you. He set the document down. It also means that their 60-day foreclosure notice is based on a legal claim they cannot actually enforce. Hazel sat with this. They could fight it, she said. They could argue the assignment. They could try, Marsh said. It would cost them considerably more than the outstanding balance, and they would lose. Chester Braun is aggressive, but he's not stupid. When I put this in front of him, he'll negotiate. What does negotiating look like in this case? In this case, Marsh said, leaning back, it looks like the bank acknowledging that the valid debt, because there was a real loan made in good faith, needs to be restructured under whatever entity actually has legal authority to hold it, which is complicated and time-consuming for them. The simpler solution is a payment arrangement that reflects your actual income and leaves the house and your equipment out of it. She looked at her hands. How long before you can put this in front of Braun? I'm writing the letter today, he said. He'll have it Friday. She left Gerald Marsh's office and walked out onto Clearwater Lane in the cold December air and stood there for a moment with her hands in her pockets. The mountain to the north of town had snow on it all the way down to the tree line. A wagon went past on the main road, the driver's breath making clouds. Somewhere nearby, someone was hammering something with the patient, regular rhythm of work that has a clear end. She thought about Daniel's desk. She thought about April, when she'd organized his papers in the cold of the front room, while Maisie slept and the world outside felt like something she was watching through glass. She'd kept everything because she couldn't stand disorder, and because some part of her, some stubborn, unglamorous part that didn't know how to give up on things, had believed, without evidence, that knowing what you had was better than not knowing. She'd been right. That was the part that was hard to take in. Not the victory of it, because it wasn't a victory yet. And even if it became one, it would be partial and expensive and nothing like clean. The part that was hard was that she had saved herself by doing, in April, in grief, with nothing but the habit of careful attention, what her mother had spent years teaching her to do. Look at what's actually there, not what you're afraid is there, and work from that. She started walking back toward Meridian Street. There was a christening gown waiting on her work table, and 3 letters she needed to write to the pending clients who hadn't confirmed yet, and the arithmetic she'd run 3 times that she needed to run a 4th time because the circumstances had shifted. The bank letter was not the end. It was not even, as it turned out, what it had claimed to be. An opening position, Eleanor had said, a starting point, not a finish. She walked home in the December cold with her hands in her pockets and her breath ahead of her, and she thought about the shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel with its morning light and afternoon light both, and she thought, not yet. But maybe by spring the ground would be different under her feet. Maybe by spring what she was building would have something more solid to stand on than stubborn and careful and not quite giving up. She turned onto Meridian Street. Through her front window she could see the lamp she'd left on, and the shape of the singer in its light, and upstairs Maisie was home from school by now, probably at the kitchen table, probably counting on her fingers over the Wednesday arithmetic. The stove would need wood. The christening gown needed another 4 hours. The 4th run of the numbers could wait until after supper. She went up the walk and opened the door and went inside, back to the specific and ordinary work of keeping everything together, one careful stitch at a time. What she didn't know yet, what she had no way to know, coming in out of the December cold with the lamp warm and the stove low, and her daughter's voice carrying down the stairs asking what was for supper, was that Chester Braun had already received a copy of Gerald Marsh's preliminary inquiry from the county records office, and that he'd spent the morning on the telephone with his supervisor in Cheyenne, and that the supervisor had said something that had made Chester Braun sit very still at his desk for a long time afterward. And that the following morning, a man named Douglas Frayne, who had done business with the Denver Mining Company and who currently held a seat on the board of the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending, was going to drive out to the Granger Ranch with a proposition that had nothing to do with Wyatt Granger and everything to do with what Hazel Brooks had just set in motion. She didn't know any of that. She knew supper and arithmetic and the christening gown waiting on the table and the careful, honest arithmetic of her own rebuilt life. It was enough for tonight. Douglas Frayne drove out to the Granger Ranch on a Thursday morning in a buggy that was too clean for the season, the kind of vehicle that announced its owner's opinion of himself before he'd said a word. Wyatt saw it coming up the north road from the barn where he was working on a stall latch that had been giving him trouble since October, and he stood with the latch in his hand and watched it come, because a clean buggy in December on a working ranch road meant someone who didn't usually travel working ranch roads, and that was rarely good news. Frayne was 60, compact, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where other people were nervous. He had a good coat, not the canvas and sheepskin of ranch work, but a wool coat, city cut, with a collar that sat correctly. He got down from the buggy without waiting for help and walked toward the barn with his hands easy at his sides, which was the walk of someone who had calculated the correct amount of casual and deployed it deliberately. "Mr. Granger," he said, "Douglas Frayne. I sit on the board of Elk Ridge Savings and Lending." Wyatt set the latch down on the fence post. "I know who you are," he said. Frayne smiled in the way that men smile when they've been recognized and have decided to treat it as a compliment regardless of the tone. "Then I'll skip the introduction. I wanted to talk to you about a matter that's come to the bank's attention regarding a woman in town, Hazel Brooks." "What about her?" Wyatt said. "You've been providing her with work," Frayne said. "Employment, referrals to other clients, transportation." He kept his voice even, pleasant, neutral. The voice of a man delivering information rather than accusations. "The bank has taken note of your involvement in her situation." "The bank," Wyatt said, "is welcome to take note of whatever it likes." Frayne looked at him for a moment. Then he changed angles slightly, the way a man does when he's been in enough conversations to know when to stop pushing one direction and try another. "There's a legal complication," he said, "regarding the debt assignment. I'm sure you're aware." "I know she has a lawyer looking at it," Wyatt said. "That's her business, not mine." "Yes," Frayne said. "But the complication, if it proceeds in court, and Gerald Marsh has a reputation for taking things to court, is going to be expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved." He paused. "Including her. Legal proceedings aren't free, even when you're in the right." Wyatt looked at him. "What is it you're actually here to say, Mr. Frayne?" The pleasant smile stayed put, which was a skill in itself. "The bank is prepared to resolve this quietly. The outstanding debt, $412, can be discharged entirely against the property. The house transfers to the bank, Mrs. Brooks relocates, and the matter is closed. No court proceedings, no extended legal costs, no uncertainty, a clean resolution." The ranch yard was quiet around them. Pete and Doyle were out on the north fence line, which meant the only sound was the horse in the clean buggy shifting its weight, and the particular winter silence of open land. Wyatt looked at Frayne's coat. He looked at the buggy. He looked at the man. "She keeps the sewing machine," Frayne added, apparently deciding this was a generous concession worth naming. "The bank has no interest in personal property." "You drove out here," Wyatt said, "to ask me to talk her into giving up her house." "I drove out here," Frayne said, "to offer an alternative to what could be a very unpleasant few months for a woman who is clearly already managing a difficult situation." "And you came to me instead of to her because she's unlikely to see reason when she's in the middle of it," Frayne said. The pleasant neutrality slipped slightly on that. Not much, but enough. "You clearly have her confidence. A word from you carries weight." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. A crow landed on the fence post about 10 feet away, looked at both of them with the crow's fundamental lack of respect for human situations, and flew off again. "Get back in your buggy," Wyatt said. Frayne held his position for another 2 seconds, just long enough to register that he'd understood and had considered pushing further and had decided against it. Then he nodded once, with the specific nod of a man filing something away, and went back to his buggy and left the way he'd come. Wyatt stood in the yard and watched the buggy go back down the north road. He stood there for longer than necessary, doing what he did when something had happened that needed things were acting on, which was look at it from several directions slowly, rather than one direction fast. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a note. He sent Pete into town with it that afternoon. The note was short. It said, Frayne came to the ranch this morning. You need to know. Come when you can. She came the following day with Maisie, which was a Friday, and Pete had barely gotten the wagon stopped before she was down from the seat with her basket over her arm and the expression of someone who had been thinking since Thursday afternoon. Maisie went to the barn without being told. The kittens were now large enough to have developed personalities and small enough to still be manageable, a state of affairs that had approximately 3 weeks left to run before they became just cats, and Maisie was committed to making the most of it. Hazel came inside and Wyatt told her everything Frayne had said, in the order he'd said it, without editorializing except once at the end. He said you were unlikely to see reason, he said, when you were in the middle of it. She sat with that for a moment. Her hands were flat on the kitchen table. She had a specific way of being angry that didn't look like most people's anger. It went inward and got very still, like a fire when you close the damper down. He came to you, she said. He drove out here and asked you to talk me into surrendering the house. That's what he did, Wyatt said. Because he thinks... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Then, he thinks that if a man tells me it's the sensible thing to do, I'll believe it's the sensible thing to do. That's my read, Wyatt said. What did you tell him? I told him to get back in his buggy. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude, but sat somewhere between the two and also somewhere past both of them. She looked at the table. The debt assignment is invalid, she said. Gerald Marsh is certain of it. If Frayne knows about the legal complication, he knows the bank is going to lose if this goes to a judge. He's trying to settle before it gets there. Which means your position is stronger than his letter made it look, Wyatt said. Yes. She was quiet. Gerald Marsh said the same thing. He said Braun's 60-day notice was an opening position. She looked up. Frayne's sending someone out here to pressure you into pressuring me. That's not the move of a bank that thinks it has a solid claim. Wyatt nodded. No, it isn't. I need to tell Gerald Marsh about this visit, she said. The fact that Frayne came to you specifically, that's relevant. It suggests the bank has already determined its legal position is weak enough that they're looking for other leverage. I'll write down everything he said, Wyatt said. Time, what he drove, exact words as close as I can remember them. Gerald Marsh can have it Monday. She looked at him. There was something in her face she was managing, not suppressing exactly, but holding carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you're carrying it across an uneven floor. You should know, she said, that when you sent that note, when you told me instead of doing anything about it yourself, that mattered. He didn't say anything. I mean it, she said. You could have called on Frayne yourself, gone to the bank, handled it. It wasn't mine to handle, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. She looked at the table again. People have been handling things that aren't theirs to handle my entire adult life, she said. They mean well, most of them. They look at how I look and they think, she needs help, she can't manage, I'll step in. She paused. Daniel wasn't much different, if I'm honest. He took out the loan without telling me because he decided I had enough to worry about. A flat silence. I found out about the collateral in a letter from a lawyer in Denver, 3 weeks after the cave-in. Wyatt didn't fill the silence. He'd learned that she didn't always need the silence filled. Anyway, she said after a moment, Gerald Marsh gets the information about Frayne's visit Monday. I'll come back when there's news from the bank. She stood, put on her coat. What coats do you have for me today? Nothing new, he said. I just wanted you to know about Fran. She nodded. She picked up her basket. Then, at the kitchen door, she stopped. The christening gown is finished, she said. The clients paid on time and said they'd tell anyone who asked. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she reported things she was pleased about, but hadn't decided yet to fully claim. That's 4 referrals from that one job. I know, he said. Doyle's sister-in-law is one of them. She looked at him. I didn't know that. She's been asking about having a dress made for the spring. A proper dress. not amend or an alteration. He said it the same way he'd mentioned the Allards, not presenting it as anything other than information, but information he'd had and had chosen to pass along. Her name's Ruth. She's about your age. Hazel considered this. A commission dress, she said. She was thinking. He could tell she was thinking because her eyes went slightly unfocused, the way they did when she was running numbers or planning a sequence of work. That's different from repair work. If she wants something made to her measure from the beginning, that's a different rate. I figured you'd know what to charge. I do, she said, coming back from wherever she'd been. Tell Doyle she can come to the house on Meridian Street. Tuesday mornings I'm there until noon. She called for Maisie, who emerged from the barn with hay on her coat and the expression of someone who had accomplished something significant, and they went back out to the wagon. Wyatt stood in the yard and watched them go, and thought about Frayn's clean buggy, and the calculation behind the visit, and what it said about where things actually stood. Gerald Marsh received Wyatt's written account of the visit on Monday morning, and spent approximately 45 minutes reading it and making notes in the margin. Then he put on his coat and walked 3 blocks to the Elk Ridge Savings and Lending and asked to see Chester Braun. Hazel heard about this afterward, secondhand through Gerald Marsh's own account at their Wednesday meeting, which he gave in his precise, slightly pleasureless way that she'd come to appreciate specifically because it didn't dress things up. Chester Braun had been in his office. Gerald Marsh had sat down without being invited and placed Wyatt's account of Frayn's visit on the desk, along with his formal legal opinion regarding the debt assignment, and said 3 sentences. The assignment was invalid, the foreclosure notice was unenforceable, and the fact that a board member had personally visited a third party to pressure an indirect withdrawal from legal proceedings was the kind of thing that county judges found interesting. Chester Braun had read all of it. He had not said much. He had said he would need to consult with the board. How long? Hazel asked. 2 weeks, at the most, Gerald Marsh said. Braun is not the problem anymore. Braun is just the man who has to clean up what Frayn made worse. He folded his hands on the desk. The bank's actual exposure here is not just your debt. If the Denver assignment was invalid, they need to examine every debt they acquired in that transaction. There may be others in the same position. They will settle with you quickly because you're the one with a lawyer, and settling with you quietly is cheaper than you becoming the first of several. She sat with this. I'm not the only one, she said. Almost certainly not, Marsh said. I don't know who else is in the same position. That's the bank's problem, not ours. Our problem is your house, and your machine, and your 60-day notice. And on those 3 points, I expect to have something in writing from Chester Braun before Christmas. She walked back to Meridian Street in the December cold for the second time in 3 weeks, with her hands in her pockets and her breath making clouds. And this time the feeling in her chest was different from the last time. Last time it had been cautious and provisional, the careful arithmetic of someone who'd been wrong about good news before. This time it was something quieter and more solid, not triumph. Nothing was finished, Marsh had been clear about that, but the particular sensation of ground that holds. She got home and found Eleanor Briggs on her porch. Not knocking, just sitting in the chair Hazel kept there, and looking at the street with the equanimity of someone who had decided a certain number of years ago that waiting for things was just another form of living. She had a covered dish on her lap. Pot roast, Eleanor said without preamble. My sister sent me too much. Maisie home yet? 20 minutes, Hazel said. Good. Eleanor stood, handed her the dish. Well? Hazel looked at her. Gerald Marsh thinks the bank will settle before Christmas. Eleanor made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite language. Then she said, I told you Chester Braun wasn't the problem. Chester Braun does what he's told. You were right, Hazel said. Eleanor looked at her with the sharp, unsentimental eyes of a woman who had been right about things for 70 years and had stopped finding it remarkable. Come inside, she said. It's cold. They ate the pot roast when Maisie got home, all 3 of them at the kitchen table, which happened without planning and felt natural in the way things do when they've found the shape they were meant to be in. Maisie told Eleanor about the kittens at the ranch, in specific and escalating detail, and Eleanor listened with complete attention and asked follow-up questions with the seriousness of someone receiving important testimony, and Hazel sat across from both of them and ate Eleanor Briggs's sister's pot roast, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't name precisely, but that was warm and real and had nothing to do with the stove. 2 days later, Ruth Doyle came to the house on Meridian Street on a Tuesday morning, as arranged, and turned out to be a tall, spare woman of 38 who looked at Hazel's work table and her basket and the singer in the front room and said, before anything else, "Doyle says you're the best seamstress in the county. I told him I'd see for myself." Hazel looked at her. "What do you need?" "A dress for spring, something I can wear to the Allard wedding and then to other things after. I don't want something I wear once." Ruth turned slightly, assessing the room. "I can't be talked into pastels. I look like I'm dying in anything pale." "What colors work for you?" Hazel asked. "Green," Ruth said immediately. "Or rust. Dark colors generally." Hazel looked at her coloring, her bone structure, the way she held herself, which was straight-backed without being stiff. She was already seeing the silhouette in her head, the way she always did, the way her mother had taught her to look at a person and see the garment that was already latent in them, waiting for the right hands to bring it forward. "Sit down," she said. "I need measurements, and I need to know where you'll be wearing it." They spent an hour together, which became 2 without either of them deciding it would. Ruth was direct and specific about what she wanted, which Hazel appreciated, and she asked real questions about the construction, not the polite questions of someone trying to seem interested, but genuine curiosity about how the thing would be built. She had opinions about the neckline that were good opinions. She changed her mind twice about the sleeve length, and both times gave a clear reason. By the time she left, Hazel had a complete picture in her head, and 6 pages of notes in the small, precise handwriting she used for commission work. She stood in the front room after Ruth left and looked at the notes. A commission dress. A real one. Built from nothing, made to one person's body and preference in life. It was different from repair work, the way planting is different from tending. It was the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something, and she stood there in her front room with her notes and felt the difference in her hands. She went to the work table and started the preliminary sketches. The letter from Chester Braun came on a Thursday, 11 days after Gerald Marsh's visit to the bank. She read it at the kitchen table with her coat still on because she'd just come in and Maisie wasn't home yet, and she'd seen the bank's return address and sat down immediately. It was 3 pages, formal and dense with language that she could follow about 2/3 of without help. The third she took to Gerald Marsh the following morning. His summary was short. The bank was withdrawing the foreclosure notice. The outstanding debt was being reclassified as unsecured, which meant it was no longer attached to the house or the machine as collateral, and was being restructured as a payment arrangement of $12 a month for 36 months. The bank acknowledged, in language that had been engineered to sound like something other than an admission, that the original assignment documentation required review, and that pending that review the security arrangement could not be maintained. $12 a month. For 3 years. Against an income that was already producing more than that in a good month and was growing. She sat in Gerald Marsh's office and read that part 3 times. "It's not a complete victory," Marsh said. He was watching her with the expression he reserved for moments when he expected a reaction and was withholding judgment on what kind it would be. "The debt is still there. You're still paying it." "I know," she said, "but the house is mine. The machine is mine." "Yes," he said, "they are." She looked at the letter. She thought about the kitchen table in April, Daniel's papers spread across it, the box of documents she'd organized because she couldn't stand the disorder, the original note with the date stamp in different ink that she'd noticed because she looked carefully at things, because her mother had spent years teaching her to look carefully at things. She thought about Roy Hicks's tavern and the walk home through the snow and the $12 that was everything she'd had, and Maisie on her shoulder whispering, "Let's go, Mama. We can't pay." "Thank you," she said to Gerald Marsh. "You did most of it," he said. "I formalized what you'd already found." She paid his remaining fee from the tin box behind the flour sack, which was no longer as thin as it had been in November, and went out onto Clearwater Lane and stood in the December air for the 3rd time, looking at the mountain. She didn't stand there as long this time. She had work to do. Ruth Doyle's commission dress was waiting. The Allard word of mouth was still moving. She'd gotten 2 more inquiries that week, both for repair work, but real repair work, the kind that paid. The shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel was still on the table for spring, and with the debt restructured, the arithmetic had changed into something she could actually navigate. But first she had to tell someone, and the person she most wanted to tell was not here on Clearwater Lane. She walked to the livery on Main Street and asked Tom Elias, who had a horse she sometimes hired for longer trips, if she could take the roan out for 3 hours. Tom charged her fare, as he always had, and she rode north out of town in the December cold with her coat buttoned up to her chin and her breath coming fast from something that wasn't entirely the cold air. And when she came up the north road to the Granger Ranch, she found Wyatt in the yard working on the water trough with Pete, and he looked up when she came through the gate, and she watched his face read her face, all of it, in about 2 seconds. "Marcia's letter," he said. "The foreclosure is withdrawn," she said, still on the horse. "The debt is restructured, $12 a month. The house is mine." Pete, who had presumably been briefed on the situation at some point in the preceding weeks, said well, in a tone that covered a great deal. Then he took his wrench and found something to do on the other side of the trough. Wyatt walked over to the horse. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. The winter light was flat and gray above the ranch, and the snow on the mountain to the north had come down to the first tree line, and the air smelled like cold and wood smoke, and somewhere nearby one of the kittens, who had now graduated to the general barn population, was making the specific sound kittens make when they feel overlooked. "You went to Marsh yourself," Wyatt said. "You found the note. You found the ink." "I kept everything," she said, "since April." "I know you did," he said. He put his hand on the horse's neck, not looking away from her. "I know you did." She looked at him for a moment with something that had been building for a long time and had not yet found a form she trusted, and then she looked away, out over the yard and the barn and the fence line where Pete was now doing something with enormous concentration, and she breathed in the cold December air. "I need to get back," she said. "Tom Elias's horse." "I know," he said. "I have Ruth's dress to start cutting tomorrow." "I heard she came by." "She has good opinions about sleeve length," Hazel said. She changed her mind twice, and both times she was right. He almost smiled. She'd learned to see the version of it that didn't fully arrive. The slight change around his eyes, the way his face settled differently for a moment. "Come by Monday," he said. "I've got a saddlebag that needs the stitching on the strap redone. It's pulling." "Monday," she said. She turned Tom Elias's roan and went back down the north road toward town, and behind her the ranch sat solid in the flat winter light, and the mountain had snow down to the tree line, and Pete had apparently found whatever he'd needed to fix on the far side of the trough, and had fixed it, and Wyatt stood in the yard for a while after the sound of the hoofbeats had faded, and then went back to work on the water trough. In the house on Meridian Street, on the work table by the window, Ruth Doyle's preliminary sketches were laid out in a row: neckline, sleeve, silhouette, hem. A commission dress in dark green, built to one woman's body and life, waiting to be made from nothing. And in the front room the singer sat in the afternoon light that came through the window between 2 and 4 o'clock, same as it always did, same as it had since April, patient and present and entirely hers. The house was hers. The machine was hers. The work was hers. And the $12 a month, which was what $412 of inherited disaster had been reduced to by stubbornness and careful attention, and an old lawyer who found things interesting, was a number she could manage without breaking anything else in the process. She didn't know yet what came after managing. She hadn't let herself think that far. But she'd thought about the shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel more than once in the last week. Thought about morning light and afternoon light both. Thought about a sign on a door and clients who came to a professional space rather than her front room. Thought about what it would mean to build something visible rather than something hidden in a house on a side street that people could only find through word of mouth. She hadn't let herself want it yet, not fully. Wanting things fully was still a skill she was relearning, slowly, in pieces, like a language you studied as a child and then didn't speak for years. But she was getting there, one stitch at a time. Ruth Doyle's dress came together in the last 2 weeks of December, during the stretch of days between the bank letter and Christmas, when the town went quieter than usual and the cold settled in properly, the kind that stayed below freezing even in the afternoon sun. Hazel worked on it in the mornings before the light shifted, cutting and basting and fitting in stages, with Ruth coming by twice for adjustments that turned into longer visits than either of them had planned. Ruth was the kind of person who talked while standing still for measurements, which most people couldn't manage. They either went silent with the self-consciousness of being looked at and handled, or they moved too much trying to seem natural. Ruth stood exactly where Hazel put her and kept a running commentary on whatever was in her head, which turned out to be her brother Doyle's ongoing argument with the north fence, The specific failures of the Elk Ridge schoolteacher who'd lasted one winter before going back to Ohio, and her opinion of the Allard wedding, which she'd been invited to and had feelings about, mostly involving the reception food. "The bride's dress," Ruth said, on the second fitting, standing with her arms slightly out while Hazel worked the left shoulder seam. "I heard you fixed it." "I did," Hazel said. She had a pin between her teeth and took it out before continuing. "The previous seamstress had done work on it that needed to be undone first. Dottie Allard told my sister-in-law it was a disaster when you opened it up. There was a cracked bone in the bodice," Hazel said, "and a doubled seam that had pulled the front off center." Ruth was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone absorbing information about craft. "Could you see all that from the outside when you first looked at it?" "The pull, yes. The bone, no. Oh, I had to open the lining." Hazel moved to the right shoulder. "Your mother made wedding dresses," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. She'd apparently picked that up from somewhere in the community network of information that moved through Elk Ridge faster than the mail. "She did, for 12 years in St. Louis, before she got sick." "And you learned from her?" "Everything I know about structure," Hazel said. "The technical side. The fitting I figured out on my own mostly. Every person's body is different and patterns lie." Ruth made a sound that was part laugh, part recognition. "Patterns lie. That's the truest thing I've heard about sewing." Hazel almost smiled. She moved around to check the hem level, which was the part that always required the most adjustment, because Ruth was not built symmetrically, as most people weren't. Her right hip sat fractionally higher than her left, which meant that what looked level on paper sat crooked on her body. And what looked crooked on paper was the thing that would actually hang straight. She'd noted it at the first fitting and built the correction into the cut, and now she needed to verify it was holding. It was. She sat back on her heels and looked at the overall line of the dress and felt the quiet satisfaction that good work produced, which was different from pride. It didn't have pride's temperature, its need to be witnessed. It was more like the satisfaction of a calculation that came out even. The thing was what it was supposed to be. "It's right," she said, mostly to herself. Ruth looked down at, then sideways at the window that served as a mirror for fittings. She turned once, slowly. "Yes," she said. "It is." She paid that afternoon before she left, the full agreed amount, and added $10 that she set on the work table separately. "That's for the waiting list," she said matter-of-factly. "I want to be on it, for whatever you make next that you think would suit me." Hazel looked at the $10. "I don't have a waiting list." "You should start one," Ruth said, putting on her coat, "because you're going to need it." After Ruth left, Hazel stood at the work table for a while with the $10 in front of her. She thought about what Ruth had said. "You're going to need it," with the particular confidence of someone who'd decided something and was reporting a fact rather than making a prediction. She thought about the shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel, about which she had spoken to no one since December except herself, and the private accounting she did at the kitchen table some evenings when Maisie was asleep, and the arithmetic felt like company. She put the $10 in the tin box behind the flour sack. Then she wrote Ruth Doyle's name at the top of a clean page in the small notebook she used for job records, and wrote next to it, "Commission dress, dark green wool, completed desk 22. Deposit held for future commission." She looked at the page for a moment. Then she wrote, below Ruth's name, a line she hadn't planned to write. "Waiting list." Under it, spaces, 4. Then she crossed out 4 and wrote 3, because Ruth Doyle's name was already on the page. She closed the notebook. She went to make supper. Christmas came and went quietly, the way it did when you were two people in a house with limited funds and limited family. Maisie got a doll that Hazel had made from a pattern she'd remembered from childhood, cloth-bodied with embroidered features and hair made from brown yarn that she'd unraveled from a worn sweater and retwisted. She'd worked on it after Maisie was asleep for 3 weeks, and it wasn't perfect. The face sat slightly asymmetrical because she'd done it freehand, and the hair was thicker on one side than the other. But Maisie held it with the complete acceptance of a child who doesn't distinguish between love and craft because she hasn't learned yet that some people try to make that separation. Eleanor Briggs came by on Christmas afternoon with a pie, stayed for 3 hours, and taught Maisie a card game that Hazel suspected was not entirely appropriate for 6-year-olds, but that Eleanor had clearly decided fell within acceptable limits. Wyatt sent a note with Pete on Christmas morning, just a note, a few lines, saying he hoped the holiday was warm and that there was a horse blanket he'd been procrastinating about that he'd bring by Monday. She read it at the kitchen table while Maisie slept in and then sat with it for a moment before putting it in the drawer where she kept the things she wasn't ready to classify. January arrived with the particular relentlessness of Wyoming January, which is to say it arrived hard and stayed hard and gave no indication of reconsidering. The cold was genuine cold, the kind that made the windows fog from inside and turned the water in the kitchen pitcher to a skim of ice by morning if she forgot to bring it close to the stove at night. She'd stuffed the rags in the gap under the back door, finally, in November, and she was grateful for it every morning. The work didn't stop for January. If anything, January was when people found the time to think about the things they'd been putting off, and several of them thought about Hazel Brooks. The christening gown referrals had produced 2 more jobs in their wake, a coat with a lining that had separated from the shell and needed to be reattached by someone who understood how linings behaved rather than just how thread worked, and a quilt from an older woman on the edge of town, Mrs. Haley, who had started a double wedding ring pattern in 1887 and set it aside unfinished and wanted it completed in time for a granddaughter's birthday in March. The quilt was technically outside Hazel's primary work. She hesitated when Mrs. Haley asked, because quilt finishing required a specific knowledge of the original maker's intentions, and taking over someone else's half-finished work was more like joining a conversation midway than starting one fresh. But she went and looked at it, and spread it out on Mrs. Haley's kitchen table, and saw immediately where the old woman had been in her mind when she stopped. The pattern was 3/4 complete, and the final quarters pieces were cut and sorted in a bag, ready, and the piecing logic was clear once you looked at it long enough. She took the quilt and the bag of pieces and the 3 evenings it required, and when she brought it back finished, Mrs. Haley looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then said, "You can see where I stopped." "Yes," Hazel said. "And where you started?" Hazel pointed. The join was honest if you knew to look for it. Her tension was slightly more even than Mrs. Haley's, and the older woman's work had a slight rightward drift that Hazel had matched in the first few inches and then allowed to correct naturally, so the final quarter sat level but didn't announce the transition. "There," she said, "but only if you're looking." "I'm looking," Mrs. Haley said. Then, "It's better. The second half is better. I know my own work." She picked up the quilt's edge and felt the seam. "You matched my tension on purpose and then fixed it." "I thought that was better than making the join obvious." Mrs. Haley looked at her. "You thought about what I would want." "I tried to," Hazel said. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she named a price for the work that was more than Hazel had planned to ask. When Hazel started to object, Mrs. Haley put up one hand. "I'm 74 years old," she said. "I know what things are worth. Don't argue with me about it." Hazel didn't argue. Word continued to move. Word always moved. That was the thing about small places, the thing that cut both ways. The same network that had moved Roy Hicks's opinion of her and the whispered assessments of the people who'd turned her away from their doors was now moving something different, and the difference was not in the speed or the reach, but in the content. Hazel heard pieces of it through Eleanor, through Maggie Fenn, through Ruth Doyle, who turned out to be a remarkably effective transmitter of specific information. The word was not complimentary in the vague, polite way of small-town kindness. It was specific. She fixes things right. She knows what she's doing. She doesn't oversell, and she doesn't undercharge. She showed up to the Allard house and looked at that dress and told them the truth about what was wrong with it. That last one mattered more than she'd expected. People trusted the truth-telling more than the skill, it turned out, which said something about what they'd been getting before. She got a visit in late January from a woman she didn't know. Someone from one of the outlying homesteads, 17 miles north, who'd heard about the saddle blanket contract from the ranching operation in that direction. The woman's name was May Dorsey, and she was 40-something and tired in the specific way of homestead women, tired from the ground up. And she sat at Hazel's kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee and said, without much preamble, "I've been trying to find work that I can do from home. My husband's not well. I can't leave for long." Hazel looked at her. "What kind of work?" "Anything with my hands," May said. "I used to mend coats, blankets, basic stuff. Nothing like what you do." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I can do simple work. Seams, patches. The things that don't need trained eyes." Hazel sat with that for a moment. She'd been thinking, had been thinking since November, if she was honest, since the saddle blanket contract and the hotel curtains, and the work volume that kept expanding in directions she hadn't planned, about capacity. There was more work than she could do alone. There was going to be more still if the spring went the way it seemed to be going. She'd been thinking about it the way she'd thought about the shop room, carefully, without committing to it yet, running it alongside the other numbers in her head. "Come back Thursday," she said to May Dorsey. "Bring me samples of your mending, whatever you have at home." May looked at her. She'd been expecting something else, apparently. A polite refusal, or a referral somewhere else, or sympathy without substance. "Come back Thursday," she repeated. "I have a contract for work I can't take on alone," Hazel said plainly. "If your work is solid enough, I'll subcontract the straightforward mending. You do it from home, I check the output, you get paid per piece." She looked at May's hands, which were calloused and capable looking. "I can't promise anything until I see the samples, but come Thursday." May Dorsey left with something on her face that Hazel recognized because she'd felt it herself, in the wagon on the way back from the Granger Ranch the first time, with $8 agreed for 3 coats and a wagon cover. The particular expression of someone who has been looking at a closed door for so long that the possibility of it opening requires a moment of recalibration. Thursday came. May's samples were more than solid. They were careful even, the work of someone who had learned by necessity and paid attention while doing it. Hazel put the contract together the same day. 3 ranching families' worth of straightforward repair work, priced per piece, standards documented in a single written page that she gave May to keep. May read the page twice and then looked up. "You wrote this down," she said. "So there's no confusion later about what we agreed," Hazel said. May folded the page with the focused care of someone who had learned not to lose things that mattered. "Nobody's ever put what they agreed with me in writing before," she said, "for work like this." "Then this will be the first time," Hazel said. She thought about this later, after May had gone. Thought about it the same way she'd thought about the waiting list she'd started in December. She hadn't planned to take on someone else's work. She hadn't planned a lot of things that had happened since November, when she'd walked into Roy Hicks's tavern with Maisie on her hip and $11 and the bone-deep desperation that she'd been performing composure over for weeks. The plans she'd made had been survival plans. Get through this week, manage this month, keep the machine, keep the house. Big plans had felt like things that happened to people whose circumstances permitted them, which hers didn't. But somewhere between December and January, without making a formal decision about it, she'd started building something that was larger than survival. The waiting list was larger than survival. The subcontract with May Dorsey was larger than survival. The commission dress in dark green wool was larger than survival. She wasn't sure yet what to call what it was instead. She went to Maggie Fenn in the second week of February. Maggie was behind the hotel desk when Hazel came in, going through a ledger with the focused unhappiness of someone who has found an error and is trying to locate its source. She looked up when Hazel came in, read her face, and closed the ledger. "The shop room," she said. "Yes," Hazel said. They sat in the small parlor off the hotel lobby. Maggie had coffee brought, which was a hotel habit rather than a social one. She ran on coffee the way the hotel ran on reservation deposits, continuously and with professional commitment. Hazel had her notebook. She laid out the numbers the way Gerald Marsh had laid out the legal situation, clearly, in sequence, without minimizing the risks. "My income from October through January," she said, "including the subcontract I've started with a woman called May Dorsey, who is doing straight repair work on 3 ranch contracts while I handle the skilled commissions. The shop rent you mentioned in November. The $12 a month to the bank. Fixed costs for materials, hardware, thread." She turned the notebook to face Maggie. "I've run this 4 ways. Every way I run it, the shop is viable by April." Maggie looked at the numbers. She spent more time than a quick look required, which was a good sign. People who were going to say no didn't read deeply. "You've got a subcontractor," she said. 2, possibly by spring, Hazel said. "There's another woman who contacted me last week, widowed, from the Hennessy place east of town. She mended tack professionally before her husband died. She's more skilled than May, which means I can give her the mid-range work and free myself for the commission pieces." Maggie set the notebook down and looked at her. She had the expression of someone recalculating something. When we talked in November, you were doing repair work out of a front room. I was. And now you have 2 subcontractors and a waiting list. 3 names on the waiting list, Hazel said. I keep the list in the notebook. Ruth Doyle's name is first. Maggie sat back. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The hotel lobby beyond the parlor door had its midday traffic, a couple checking in, someone asking about the road east, the ordinary friction of a business that kept moving. The room is still available, Maggie said. I held it because I believed what I said in November. You needed a real space. I wanted to be right about that. Were you? Hazel said. It came out straighter than she'd meant it, but Maggie Fenn didn't seem to mind directness. Yes, Maggie said, simply. You've been running a business out of your kitchen for 4 months. Everything you've built is real. The shop room gives it a door with your name on it. She looked at the notebook again. April 1st. That gives you 6 weeks to build toward it. I need a sign, Hazel said. On the door. I've been thinking about the name. Maggie looked at her. What name? Brooks Tailoring and Dressmaking, Hazel said. She'd been saying it to herself in her head since January, trying it out the way you try on a coat before you buy it. I thought about something that sounded more formal or larger. But my mother's name was Brooks before she married, and my name is Brooks because Daniel is gone, and the work I'm building is... She paused, finding it. It's mine. It should have my name. Maggie looked at her for a long moment, with the particular look of a woman who had built something with her own name on it and knew what that meant. Brooks Tailoring and Dressmaking, she repeated. I'll have the sign painted at cost. I know a man who does good lettering. Hazel looked at her. You don't have to... Having a seamstress in the building, Maggie said, with the comfortable authority of someone closing an argument they've already won, is useful to me. I told you that in November. The sign is part of the arrangement. Hazel sat with this. Then she put her hand across the table and they shook on it, which was not how she'd expected the meeting to end. She'd expected more negotiation, more conditions, more of the sideways movement that most agreements required. But Maggie Fenn apparently did things the way she'd indicated she would, directly and without drama, and the handshake was solid and complete. She walked back to Meridian Street in the February cold, which was the same cold she'd been walking through since November, but felt different now in a way that wasn't about temperature. She thought about April and the sign with her name on it, and the light in that room, morning and afternoon both. She thought about May Dorsey's careful folding of the written agreement. She thought about the waiting list with 3 names. She was still thinking about all of it when she turned onto Meridian Street and found Wyatt sitting on the porch step. He wasn't in the chair. That was Eleanor's chair, and apparently he had some instinct about it. He was on the top step with his hat on his knee, which was becoming a posture she associated with him having something specific to say. He stood when he saw her coming up the walk. I wasn't expecting you until Monday, she said. I know, he said. I was in town anyway. Supplies. He looked at her face. Something happened. I signed for the shop room, she said. Maggie Fenn, April 1st. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, April 1st. He turned his hat once. That's yours then. It is, she said. She went up the porch steps and past him to the door, and then stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. You should come see it, she said, when it's set up. In April. She said it the way she said most things that cost something, level, plain, without dressing it up. I'd like you to see it. He looked at her. He'd gotten better at not filling the silence, she'd noticed, or maybe she'd gotten better at not needing it filled. I'll be there, he said. She nodded and went inside. From the kitchen, she could hear Maisie arriving home from school, the particular knock and push of a child who knows the door and doesn't wait for it. And then her daughter's voice came up the stairs. Mama, is Mr. Granger on the porch? He was, Hazel called down. He's leaving. He waved at me on the street, Maisie said, materializing at the kitchen door with her coat half on and her school bag dragging. He was buying flour at the mercantile. He bought a lot of flour. He has a ranch, Hazel said. Ranches need flour. Maisie considered this with the thoroughness she brought to most things. He bought peppermint sticks, too, she said. He gave me one. She produced it from her coat pocket, slightly lint-covered. Is that all right? Hazel looked at the peppermint stick. She thought about a man buying supplies and peppermint sticks and sitting on porch steps in February cold, because he'd wanted to know what her face looked like when something good happened. That's fine, she said. March came in warm enough to be suspicious, the way Wyoming March sometimes was. 1 week of almost spring that made everyone believe the worst was over, followed by a storm that corrected that impression. Hazel spent the first warm week in the shop room at Maggie Fenn's hotel, taking measurements and assessing the light, and planning where the work table would go and where she'd put the singer once she had it moved. She'd decided to keep the machine there rather than at the house. It was the center of the work, and the work should be where the clients came. Maisie came with her the first afternoon and walked around the empty room with her arms out, spinning once, which was her assessment method for new spaces. It's good, she said, stopping. It smells like wood and cold, but that goes away. It does, Hazel agreed. Will I come here after school? Some days, Hazel said. She was measuring the window. When there's room for you without being in the way. I'm usually not in the way, Maisie said, with great dignity. You're sometimes not in the way, Hazel said. Maisie sat down on the floor against the wall, which she did sometimes in new spaces, just sat to feel what it was like from the inside. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Mama, is this yours? Hazel set down the measuring tape. She looked at the room, at the window with its double light, the good walls, the floor that only needed sweeping. She looked at her daughter sitting on the floor against the wall with her school bag between her knees, 6 years old and careful and paying attention. Yes, she said. It is. Maisie nodded once, satisfied, the way she nodded when something was the way it was supposed to be. She got up and brushed off the back of her coat and picked up her school bag. I'm going to go see if Maggie has cookies, she said. She went. Hazel stood alone in the room with the afternoon light coming through the south window and her measuring tape in her hand and her name already on the sign that the painter was finishing this week, and she felt something so complete that she didn't try to name it, didn't try to hold on to it, just let it be what it was for the full length of one honest breath. Then she picked up her notebook and kept going. The sign went up on a Tuesday in the last week of March, 4 days before the official opening date Hazel had settled on, April 1st, the same date she'd agreed with Maggie Fenn, which she'd chosen partly for its practicality and partly because there was something that appealed to her about beginning on the first day of a new month, clean and without ambiguity. The painter was a quiet man named Calhoun who did lettering for the Mercantile and the hotel and 2 of the businesses on Main Street, and he'd done the sign in black paint on a cream-painted board. Brooks Tailoring and Dressmaking in letters that were plain and well-spaced, readable from across the street without being ornate. Hazel had looked at his preliminary sketch and asked him to make the letters slightly narrower, more upright, because she wanted it to look like work rather than decoration. Calhoun had nodded without argument and done exactly that. When he hung it beside the door of the shop room, which had its own entrance from the hotel's side corridor, a detail Maggie had pointed out when they were finalizing the arrangement, giving clients a way in without going through the hotel lobby. Hazel stood on the sidewalk and looked at it from across the street for a long moment. Eleanor Briggs was standing beside her because Eleanor had a talent for being present at consequential moments that Hazel had stopped being surprised by. Well, Eleanor said. Yes, Hazel said. Your mother would have said something useful right now, Eleanor said, not unkindly. I'll leave you to imagine what it was. Hazel didn't say anything. She was looking at her name on the sign, Brooks. Her mother's name before she married, her own name now by the particular arithmetic of widowhood. Not what she'd have chosen, but hers all the same, fully and without qualification. She thought about her mother's hands, which had looked like her own hands, and about the singer that was now positioned under the south window of the shop room where the morning light fell on it between 8 and 11, which was when she did the finest work. It's right, she said, finally. Eleanor put her hand on Hazel's arm for exactly 1 second, which was Eleanor's version of an embrace, and then removed it. Open date is Saturday? She said. Thursday, Hazel said. I moved it up. Eleanor looked at her. Why Thursday? Because I've been waiting long enough, Hazel said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. But Eleanor heard what was under it, the way Eleanor generally did, and she made the sound that wasn't quite language and nodded once and went back to whatever she'd been doing before she'd stopped to stand on the sidewalk with Hazel. The 4 days between the sign going up and the opening were not restful. She moved the Singer with Wyatt's help on Wednesday morning. He brought Pete and the wagon, and they carried the machine down the stairs of the Meridian Street house in a process that was tense and slow and required 3 stops for rest and 1 full minute of standing on the first floor landing while Pete and Wyatt negotiated the angle without dropping it or taking out the banister. It arrived at the shop room without damage, which Hazel had been more anxious about than she'd admitted to anyone. The Singer was the beginning of all of it. She'd carried it on a wagon from Cheyenne, and she'd carry it to the next place after this one if she had to, but she did not want it damaged on a staircase because of an angle problem. When it was set under the south window, and she'd run a test line on a scrap of muslin and found the tension correct and the stitch even, she sat back and felt her shoulders drop from a position they'd apparently been in since she came downstairs that morning. "It's fine," Wyatt said. He was leaning against the doorframe watching her. "I know," she said. "I just needed to check." Pete had gone back to the wagon. The shop room was quiet, just the 2 of them and the machine and the morning light. She'd set up the work table the previous day, positioned the shelving she'd bought secondhand from a dry goods store that was clearing stock, arranged her thread and needle supply and the small catalog of fabric samples she'd begun collecting against future commission work. The room looked the way she'd wanted it to look, organized without being rigid, a working space rather than a display space, set up for actual use. Wyatt pushed off the doorframe and walked to the window and looked out at the side street, which was quiet at this hour. He had his hands in his coat pockets. He'd been here an hour since the wagon, and had barely said 20 words, which was normal for him, and which she'd long since stopped interpreting as anything other than what it was. A person who didn't talk unless he had something to say. "I want to tell you something," he said, without turning from the window. She looked at his back. "All right." "When I invited you and Maisie to sit down in the tavern," he said, I wasn't thinking past the meal. I wasn't thinking about coats or wagon covers or any of it. I just looked at your daughter's face and did the obvious thing." He paused. "I want to say that because I think sometimes people construct a narrative about things, about what they intended, and I didn't intend any of this. I just did what seemed right in that moment." She was quiet. He turned around then. "But I'm glad," he said, "that the obvious thing turned out to matter." She looked at him across the shop room, across the Singer and the work table and the shelving with its organized thread, in the morning light that came through the south window. She'd been looking at him, she thought, for 5 months now, in the specific way you look at something that is becoming familiar. First with the careful attention of the unfamiliar, then with the particular ease of something known. She knew the set of his shoulders. She knew the hat turning on the knee. She knew the almost smile and the way he went still when he was actually listening, which was different from the way most people went still, which was mostly just waiting. "I'm glad too," she said. It was not the whole of what she could have said, but it was true, and it was enough for now, and she thought he understood that. He nodded. He put his hat on. "I'll let you get to it," he said. "Monday. I've got a jacket that came apart at the yoke. Doyle wore it into a fence." "How did he manage that?" she said. "Doyle finds ways," Wyatt said, and that was the almost smile, complete and present for once. And then he went out the door and she heard his boots on the corridor floor and then on the street outside. She turned to the Singer and threaded it for the day's work, and the morning light fell on her hands, and she began. The opening was not an event. She hadn't planned an event. She'd seen what events required in terms of preparation and presentation and managed expectation, and she was one person with a sewing machine and 2 subcontractors and a waiting list of 4 names and precisely no interest in performing her own beginning for an audience. She opened the door on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock and put a card in the window that said "Open," and the first person through the door was Ruth Doyle, who had apparently been watching for the card from somewhere across the street, and who came in with the directness she applied to most things, and said, "I want to commission the second dress, spring weight. I'm thinking the rust color we discussed." The second person was a man Hazel didn't know, who'd come from one of the outlying operations and needed a work coat assessed. It had been repaired multiple times by multiple people, and he wanted someone to look at it and tell him honestly whether it was worth further repair or whether the base material had given everything it had. She looked at it on the work table and told him honestly, 2 more good seasons if she reinforced the left shoulder seam and replaced the cuffs, after which the canvas would start failing in sections, and no amount of repair would address the underlying issue. He said, 2 seasons is fine, and left it with her. By noon, she had 4 jobs. By Friday, she had 7. None of it was dramatic. It was the steady accumulation of a thing whose time had come, work finding the hands that could do it, which is not a glamorous process, but is a real one. May Dorsey brought the first batch of completed repair work Friday afternoon, and Hazel went through each piece at the work table while May sat across from her, and the work was solid enough that she found herself nodding without having decided to nod, the involuntary acknowledgement of something done correctly. "This one," she said, holding up a mended coat lining. "The join at the hem, you used a different stitch than the rest." "The material was thinner there," May said. She said it without defense, just as information. "The original stitch was pulling at the weave. I used a slip stitch instead." Hazel looked at the join. It was correct. It was more than correct. It was the right call, made on assessment rather than instruction, which was what she'd hoped May could do but hadn't been certain of. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." May received this the way she'd received most things in their arrangement, without theatrics, with a quiet directness that Hazel had come to respect. "There's a coat in the second batch that needs your eyes before I touch it," she said. "The collar material is different from the body, and I don't know what it is." "Bring it Monday," Hazel said. "I'll look at it." She paid May for the batch, in cash, at the agreed per-piece rate, counted out correctly. May folded the money into her coat pocket with the same careful focus she'd given the written agreement in January. And Hazel thought about what May had said then. "Nobody's ever put what they agreed with me in writing before," and felt the same thing she'd felt then, which was a quiet anger at all the ways competent people were treated as though they didn't merit the basic respect of a written record. The second subcontractor, the woman from the Hennessy place, started in early April. Her name was Vera, and she was 44, and had the specific capability of someone who'd trained for precision work and then spent 20 years applying it to whatever needed doing. She took the mid-range mending and the tack repair, and the alterations that required skill, but not the full architectural attention of a commission piece, and she did them in a way that required almost no correction, which freed Hazel for the work that only she could do. 3 women, Hazel thought, on a Tuesday in April, looking at the shop room that was now properly in use, herself, May, Vera, producing work that was known in the county and getting to be known beyond it. She thought about her mother's workroom in St. Louis, which she'd visited twice as a child. 3 women there too, her mother and 2 others, cutting and pinning and talking over their work in the particular companionable way of people who share a craft. She'd thought then that it was the most complete thing she'd ever seen, a room full of people doing something they knew how to do. She hadn't planned to recreate that. It had just built itself, piece by piece, from November to April, from a bowl of beef stew in Roy Hicks's tavern to a room with her name on the door and 2 women whose work she trusted, and a waiting list with 6 names on it now, because Ruth had told someone who told someone else, which was how everything moved. Roy Hicks, for his part, had come into the shop in the second week of April. She'd seen him through the window before he came through the door, and she'd had approximately 4 seconds to decide how to handle it, which was enough. She was at the work table with a sleeve pinned when he came in, and she looked up and waited. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is hoping the rehearsal was adequate. "I heard the shop was open," he said. "It is," Hazel said. He looked around the room, at the singer, the shelving, the organized work surface, the card in the window. He looked like he was recalculating something he'd calculated incorrectly before. "I've got a set of bar towels," he said. "The hemming is gone on most of them. I replace them every year because nobody in town can hem bar towels right. They come out uneven and they fray again inside a month." She looked at him. She thought about the tavern in November, his voice loud enough for the whole room, the up and down deliberate look, his assessment of her ability to fit between the tables. She thought about Maisie's whisper, "Let's go, Mama. We can't pay." And the sound of the room not looking up. "How many?" she said. 32, he said. "Per-piece rate," she said. "I'll give you a quote today, and they'll be done in a week." He nodded. He reached into his coat and produced the first 4 towels, rolled together, and set them on the corner of the work table, and she unrolled them and looked at the hemming, which was indeed wrong. The original hem had been turned under once when it should have been turned twice, which was why it failed. Amateur work, applied to something that got daily use. She could fix it. "Come back Friday," she said. Bring the rest. He came back Friday with all 32 and paid the full quote without negotiating, which she had expected him to do. He didn't apologize for the tavern, which she had also expected because men like Roy Hicks rarely found the path to that particular admission. But he came back 2 weeks later with a tablecloth that needed a new border, and a month after that with a request for 2 new aprons. And she took all of it, because the work was real and the pay was honest, and she had learned to separate people from their worst moments at least far enough to do business with them. She told Wyatt about Roy Hicks on a Monday in May, when he came in with Doyle's jacket and a horse blanket that needed restitching. He listened while she worked on the jacket collar, and when she'd finished the account, he said, "How did that feel?" She thought about it. "Strange," she said. "Not satisfying the way I thought it would be, more like closing a door that had been open and drafty." "That's usually what settling scores feels like," he said. She looked at him over the jacket. "Have you settled many?" "A few," he said. He turned the horse blanket in his hands. The satisfaction of imagining it is generally better than the thing itself. "Yes," she said, "though in this case I'm making money off his bar towels, which helps." He did the full smile then, the one that wasn't reserved and wasn't almost, just the actual thing, complete and human, and she felt it the way she felt most things that landed cleanly, without armor. May moved into June. The Allard wedding came, and Clara wrote Hazel a note afterward that she kept in the drawer with Wyatt's Christmas letter, because both of them said things plainly without trying to make them larger than they were, and she valued that in written words the same way she valued it in conversation. Ruth Doyle wore the Russ Commission dress to the wedding, and 3 people asked her about it in the same afternoon, 2 of whom subsequently contacted Hazel about commission work, which brought the waiting list to 9. The bank payment, $12, first of the month, became something she did without thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about the weight of something once it becomes part of how you carry yourself. Chester Braun's name appeared at the top of the payment receipts, and she filed each one in the tin box, which was now behind the shop's supply cabinet rather than the kitchen flour sack, and she did not think about Douglas Frayne or his clean buggy or the morning he'd driven out to the Granger Ranch to ask Wyatt to talk her into surrendering the house. Almost never thought about it. Occasionally she did, in the specific late-night way of things you haven't fully finished with. Not with bitterness, because bitterness required ongoing energy she'd decided to spend elsewhere, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. Frayne had looked at her situation and at Wyatt's proximity to it, and had calculated that a man's word in her ear was the most efficient tool available. He'd been wrong, not because men's words didn't carry weight in Elk Ridge. They did, they still did. She was not building her shop in a world that had become something other than what it was, but because he'd misread Wyatt, who turned out to be the kind of man who knew what belonged to him and what didn't. She thought about that sometimes, what it meant to be the kind of man who knew what belonged to him and what didn't. She thought it was rarer than it should be. Maisie turned 7 in June, and Pete and Doyle came with Wyatt to the small birthday supper that Eleanor organized with the particular efficiency of a woman who has planned events in conditions ranging from easy to impossible and finds easy slightly suspect. Eleanor made a cake. Hazel made Maisie a new dress in the yellow that Maisie had been requesting since February, with smocking across the bodice that took Hazel 4 evenings to do correctly, but that she'd wanted to be right because her mother had smocked her dresses as a girl, and she wanted Maisie to have the same feeling of something made precisely for her. Pete gave Maisie a carved wooden horse that he'd made himself, which was well made and clearly had taken time. Doyle gave her a set of jacks, which Eleanor looked at with mild suspicion. Wyatt gave her a book, which she received with the seriousness she reserved for books, turned over in her hands carefully, and then looked up at him with the expression she used when something was exactly right. "This one's about horses," she said. "It is," he said, "and there's a girl in it." "There is." Maisie held the book in her lap through the rest of supper with the focused contentment of a child who has found the thing she was going to be doing for the next several days. Hazel watched her daughter across the birthday table, in the yellow dress with its smocked bodice, and felt the specific gratitude that doesn't have anywhere to direct itself, not at anyone or anything in particular, just present and enormous and humbling. After supper, when Maisie had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove with the horse book open on her chest, and Eleanor had gone home, and Pete and Doyle had gone back to the ranch, Hazel and Wyatt sat on the porch, with the June evening around them, which was warm enough to sit in without coats, which in Wyoming was not a thing you took for granted. They sat without talking for a while. This was something that had become possible between them. The comfortable silence of two people who had talked about enough real things that silence didn't require filling. The street below the porch was quiet. Somewhere down the block a door closed. A horse passed on the main road, slow and unhurried. "I want to ask you something," Wyatt said. She looked at him. He had his hat on his knee, which was the position, and she'd learned to read it. "I've been thinking about it since November," he said. "Since the wagon cover, probably, if I'm honest, which I'm trying to be." He looked at his hat. "I'm not good at the decorative version of this. I don't have a lot of—" He searched for it. "Ornamentation available." "I know that about you," she said. "Good," he said. "Then I'll just say it plainly. I'd like to build a life with you, you and Maisie, and whatever that looks like when you decide what it looks like. Because I know it has to be on your terms, or it isn't worth anything." He looked up. "I'm not asking you to need me. I'm just asking if you'd want me around." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about November, the stew, the walk home, Maisie on her shoulder, the $11. She thought about the wagon cover grommets and the sheepskin lining and the note he'd sent with Pete that said, "Frayne came to the ranch this morning. You need to know." She thought about the wagon to Gerald Marsh and the Christmas note and the way he'd stood in the shop room door and said, "I just did what seemed right in that moment without making it more than it was." She thought about Daniel, who had loved her in the way he knew how, which was to make decisions on her behalf out of an instinct to protect that he'd never examined for what it cost. She did not think badly of Daniel for this. He'd been young, and the world he'd been raised in had taught him certain things were love, and she'd been young enough not to fully understand the difference. But she understood it now. She'd spent 7 months understanding it, sometimes in anger, more often in the quiet work of figuring out what she actually needed, which turned out to be not someone to protect her from the difficulty, but someone who could sit in the difficulty with her without trying to resolve it for her. "Yes," she said. "I'd want you around." He nodded. He turned his hat on his knee once, and then he stopped turning it. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not easy to live around. I get particular about things. I have opinions about how fence lines should be run that probably don't translate to other areas of life." She almost laughed. "I'm particular too," she said. "I have strong views about thread tension." "I know," he said. "I've watched you hold other people's seams up to the light with the expression of someone examining evidence at a crime scene." She did laugh then, brief and real, the kind that comes out before you've decided whether to let it. He looked at her when she laughed the way he sometimes did, like it was something he'd done right, but wasn't going to say so. "We'd argue," she said. "Probably," he said. "I don't back down easily." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the word easy and how she'd spent so long surviving that she'd started to equate difficulty with correctness, as though anything that felt manageable must be suspect. It was one of the habits you picked up in hard times that didn't always serve you when things got better. This didn't feel easy in the uncomplicated, empty way. It felt true, which was different. True things were often complicated and occasionally inconvenient, and almost always worth it. "All right," she said, not as an ending, as the beginning of something she was willing to let be what it became. He didn't reach for her hand or make any move toward the kind of gestures that people made in stories at moments like this. He just sat with her on the porch in the June evening, and they were quiet together for a while, and that was right, more right than anything more dramatic would have been, because it was honest about what they actually were, which was two people who had already proven they could sit together in difficulty and come out doing good work on the other side. Maisie found out the following week, in the oblique way children find out things, which is to say, she put together a collection of observations and arrived at a conclusion and presented it to her mother at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening as though it were simply a fact she was confirming. "Are you and Wyatt going to get married?" she said over her arithmetic. Hazel looked at her daughter. "What makes you ask that?" "He comes to the shop on Mondays," Maisie said, "and he brought me a book, and he looks at you like—" She made a gesture with her pencil that apparently stood in for the rest of the sentence. "Like what?" Hazel said. "Like when I look at something I want to be careful with," Maisie said. Hazel was quiet for a moment. "We're figuring that out," she said. Maisie nodded. She went back to her arithmetic. Then, without looking up, I already call him Wyatt. I know you do. If that changed to something else, Maisie said, carefully, I think that would be all right with me. Hazel looked at her daughter, at the bent head, the pencil moving, the studious attention to the arithmetic that was also not entirely about the arithmetic. 7 years old and already navigating the complicated space between what she hoped for and what she'd been taught not to expect, because hope had disappointed her enough in the last 14 months that she'd learned to present it sideways, as a hypothesis rather than a wish. I'll tell him you said so, Hazel said. Maisie's pencil stopped. Then it started again. Okay, she said. The summer moved the way summer moves when you're busy in it, quickly in retrospect, full while it's happening. The waiting list for commission work grew to 11 names, then contracted to 7 when Hazel cleared a backlog through August, then grew again. May Dorsey's work had improved to the point where Hazel gave her the mid-range work that had been Vera's, and Vera took on 2 of the commission assistant's tasks, the preliminary basting and the pattern adjustments, that freed Hazel for the final construction of each piece. It was a small system, imperfect and occasionally strained at the joints, but it worked. She paid the banks $12 in July, August, September. She paid October's the day it was due and sat in the shop after closing with her records spread on the work table and did the arithmetic that she'd been doing periodically since June, the long version that looked at the full 36-month payment schedule and the current income and found the month where the debt could be retired early. February. If the work held the pace it had held since spring, she could close the bank account entirely in February, 14 months ahead of schedule. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she wrote it down, put it in the notebook, and closed the notebook. It was a number to work toward, not to celebrate yet. She'd learned the difference. The framed receipt went up in October. It was not at first the receipt she'd planned to frame. She'd thought about the first payment from Wyatt for the coats and the wagon cover. But when she went looking for the specific receipt, she found it was the earlier one, the handwritten record she'd made in her notebook on the night of their first arrangement, before she'd started making formal receipts for clients. The entry read W. Granger, 3 coats, canvas, sheepskin, wool, 1 wagon cover were grommets, $8 agreed. Below that, in her small precise handwriting, first job, November 14. She had it copied onto a clean piece of paper by the sign painter Calhoun, who did it for nothing when she explained what it was and seemed pleased to be asked. She framed it in a simple frame she'd bought at the dry goods and hung it beside the shop room door, at eye level, where clients could see it when they came in. Ruth Doyle was the first to ask about it, which Hazel had expected because Ruth asked about everything. The first job, Ruth said, reading it. $8 for 3 coats and a wagon cover. And grommets, Hazel said. He added $1 for the hardware, said I'd underpriced the materials. Ruth looked at it a moment longer. He offered you more than you asked. He did. Ruth turned to look at her with the expression she wore when she was putting things together. That was the beginning, she said. Hazel looked at the framed receipt. At the entry in her own handwriting, the date, the amount, the small notation that was private shorthand for something much larger. That was the beginning, she said. She thought about the question she got sometimes, from women who came in and saw the receipt and asked about it. Young women mostly, and some older ones, women who were building things or trying to, women who were in the specific position of being capable and overlooked, and not yet sure whether capability was enough to get you where you were trying to go. She thought about what she told them, which was not a simple answer and not a story with clean edges, because the truth of how she'd gotten from November to here was not clean. It was stubborn and practical, and sometimes humiliating and built out of things that didn't look like building materials. A 6-year-old's hunger, a tin box behind a flour sack, a date stamp in different ink, the habit of keeping records for a world that might eventually care about them. What she told them, when they asked, was this. She hadn't started with a plan. She'd started with a sewing basket and a machine and a daughter and the particular stubbornness of someone who has run out of the option of giving up. The plan came later, built out of what was actually there, not out of what she'd wished was there. And every time someone had tried to decide for her what her limits were, Roy Hicks, Chester Braun, Douglas Frayne, the whole quiet chorus of sideways looks and underpriced offers, she'd found that the decision didn't actually belong to them, no matter how loud they were about it. The decision had always been hers. She just had to keep showing up until everyone else understood that. She didn't always say all of it. Sometimes she just said, "You have to know what you've got. Not what you wish you had, what you've actually got. That's the only thing you can build from." On a Saturday in November, 1 year, almost exactly, from the night Maisie's eyes had found the bowl of stew across Roy Hicks's tavern, Hazel locked the shop room at the end of the day and walked to the livery where Wyatt's wagon was waiting, and they drove north out of town on the road she'd ridden on Tom Elias's roan the day of the bank letter, with the mountain to the north carrying its first real snow. Maisie was between them on the wagon seat, asleep against her mother's arm before they were past the edge of town, the way she sometimes fell asleep in moving vehicles, suddenly and completely, as though sleep were a decision she made and committed to. Wyatt drove without rushing it, the horses finding their pace, the road familiar to all of them. "She's out," Wyatt said, without looking over. "Since the mill road," Hazel said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "November next year. The shop will be 2 years old. The bank will be paid by February," she said. "If it holds." "It'll hold," he said. She looked at him sideways. He said things like that, quiet declarative statements about what would happen. Not because he was certain of the future, but because he'd decided, she'd come to understand, that confidence in the people he trusted was something he could offer and meant to. It wasn't empty. It was the particular weight of someone who had watched carefully and decided what they believed. The ranch came into sight down the north road, the lights of the house showing yellow in the early dark. Maisie stirred when the wagon turned through the gate and made a sound and settled again, her head finding a new position against her mother's arm. Hazel sat on the wagon seat with her daughter asleep against her shoulder and the ranch ahead of them, and the mountain at their back still carrying its snow. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a tavern doorway in November a year ago with $11 and a child and the desperate composure of someone performing steadiness for an audience she didn't know. She didn't feel distant from that woman. She felt continuous with her. The same hands, the same stubbornness, the same singer under the south window, the same precise and unromantic knowledge that you built what you could from what you actually had, and that what you had was usually more than people told you it was, if you looked at it honestly and knew your own work. The wagon stopped. Wyatt got down and came around and took Maisie without waking her, which he'd learned to do somewhere in the months of this becoming a regular thing. The specific physics of transferring a sleeping child from one set of arms to another without bringing her back into consciousness. He carried her inside while Hazel tied off the horses, and when she came in from the cold, the lamp was lit in the front room, and Maisie was on the settee with her coat still on and her boots still on, and both of those things could wait until morning. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. She thought, "This is mine too, or it's becoming mine, in the way things become yours not all at once, but through accumulated presence, through the weight of being here often enough that the space makes room for you." She thought, "I didn't plan this either." She thought, "That's all right." Wyatt came back through from the kitchen with 2 cups of something hot and handed her one without ceremony, and she took it, and they stood in the front room of the Granger Ranch on a Saturday in November with the sleeping child on the settee and the snow on the mountain and the particular quiet of a place where the day's work is done, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what surviving, when you did it right, could eventually become. Not just getting through, but arriving somewhere that was actually worth arriving at, with your hands intact and your name on a door and the people you loved sleeping peacefully in the rooms around you. Outside, the snow on the mountain held the dark. The horses were stabled. The road back to town was empty and quiet and could wait until morning. Inside, the lamp burned steady. The work was done for the day. And Hazel Brooks, who had started with $11 and a sewing basket and a child's hunger and the stubborn, ordinary refusal to let any of it be the final word, stood in the warm light and let herself, at last, be home.